If you've ever paused in front of a sentence that seems to bite its own tail, you've touched the stubborn ache at the heart of the liar paradox. It isn't merely a nuisance to grammar or a trivial game of falsehood. It is a doorway into the way language, meaning, and truth pull at one another's sleeves and demand a response from us about what it could possibly mean for a sentence to be true or false. The earliest ripples of this problem are heard in the ancient clinics of Greece, in a city and a school, and a set of problems that would travel with philosophy for centuries. The section you're about to enter, this historical genesis and core concepts segment, will travel back to the birthplace of the paradox, to a figure named Eubulides of Miletus, and to the early Stoic attempts to give language a function that did not collapse under self-reference. We'll wander through what counts as a paradox when a sentence seems to assert its own falsity. We'll walk through the classic variants, the simple liar sentence in Epimenides the Cretan, and we'll parse the semantic and the logical dimensions of truth and falsity that emerge when a sentence looks straight at itself and declares, in effect, I am lying. And we'll pause to hear the echoes of later debates, to hear why this particular problem mattered not just in antiquity, but as a haunting question that resurfaces in modern semantics and logic, as if the surface of a calm lake revealed a deeper depth below with every ripple. To begin, it is worth naming what counts as a paradox in this tradition. A paradox in this ancient sense is not merely an error of reasoning. It is a situation in which the ordinary rules we rely on to assign truth values, true or false, seem to fail, or to yield a result that loops back on itself in a way that looks like a door that opens into a wall. The paradox is a thought experiment that probes the conditions under which a claim can be said to be true and under which a claim can be said to be false. It asks, in effect, what we require for a sentence to be legitimate as a statement about the world, and whether that legitimacy has to be anchored in some external reality or can be grounded in the structure of language itself. The liar paradox asks a particularly stubborn question. If a sentence says of itself that it is false, what can we say about its truth value? If it is true, then it must be false. If it is false, then it must be true. The loop is not merely a philosophical curiosity. It compels a re-examination of the rules, of the terrain on which truth claims stand, and of the boundaries between the words we utter and the world to which those words may or may not correspond. In that sense, the paradox sits at the crossroads of semantics, the study of meaning and logic, the study of rational structure and deduction. The semantic dimension asks, what do we mean when we say a sentence is true or false? What counts as reference, as assertion, as content? The logical dimension asks, given the rules of inference we accept, what happens when a sentence claims about its own truth value? The early Greek philosophers did not yet have the formal apparatus of modern logic, but they did have a practical sense that language could trap us in contradictions if we pursued truth too eagerly without first clarifying what our sentences are about and how they relate to the facts they intend to describe. The paradox becomes a staging ground for questions about how language attaches to truth, how words refer to things, and how the mind distinguishes between what is the case and what we merely say about what is the case. The birthplace of the paradox is not a single city, nor is it simply a single mind. It is a constellation of problems gathered around a particular set of thinkers who cared about argument, about what counts as a good reason for judging something true, and about the fragility of ordinary speech when it tries to say something about itself. The central figure in this constellation is Eubulides of Miletus, a philosopher whose career, though not long by later standards, left behind a trail of puzzles that would be cited and recited for centuries. He belongs to a lineage that includes the Milesian tradition, that strand of pre-Socratic inquiry that sought naturalistic explanations for how things come to be, how things change, and how we can talk about them with some degree of accuracy. Eubulides is remembered not for a single grand system, but for a set of carefully crafted paradoxes, each designed to expose a particular vulnerability in our ordinary ways of speaking about truth, time, and order. In ancient lists of philosophers, documents that functioned as reputational maps rather than as comprehensive histories, Eubulides repeatedly appears as the master of paradox. He is praised, celebrated, and invoked as a representative problem maker, a person who could coax you to see how a sentence that seems perfectly straightforward could dance on the blade edge of inconsistency. One anecdote about Eubulides helps to fix that image in our minds. It is told in the manner of the ancient biographers and later commentators. He was reputed to possess a knack for posing questions that would put his interlocutors on the spot, questions that were not meant to humiliate them, but to reveal the fragility of the ground on which they stood when they spoke of truth. He was said to be the master of paradox in the lists of philosophers, a title that suggests at once both admiration and caution. The anecdote emphasizes not merely his cleverness, but the way in which paradoxes function as tools for philosophical education. They force us to step back from our habitual confidence and to inquire into the presuppositions that underwrite our daily judgments about what is the case and what is true. The ancient sources do not merely record that Eubulides formulated paradoxes. They present him as a person who could show a room full of people that their ordinary talk could run into a wall if left unchecked by careful specification of language and definition. If you imagine a classroom with a sage-like figure presenting a paradox and then watching students try to resolve it, you have a rough sense of the pedagogical function these puzzles served in antiquity. The paradoxical tradition also contains species of puzzles that look, on the surface, quite different from the stark liar sentence but share the same bone structure: self-reference, scale, and the attempt to quantify or qualify things that ought to be definite. The Sorites paradox, for example, is often attributed to Eubulides as well, and it asks a seemingly innocent question: how many grains of sand make a heap? If you start with one grain and add one more, do you ever cross into a heap? The chain of addition seems continuous, but the category heap is discrete. At what precise point does a pile cease to be a mere grain and become a heap? That question in its own right does not require self-reference to yield a paradox, but it does reveal something about the fragile boundaries between vague language and sharp classification. In the way the Sorites unsettles ordinary usage, the liar paradox unsettles the same ground but with the added weight of self-reference. Eubulides' involvement with these puzzles helps to cement the sense that paradox in his hands is not a mere curiosity, but a method for pressing language into a sharper form of scrutiny. And yet the ancient curiosity about paradoxes was not the sole preserve of Eubulides. The early Stoics, who had come to regard language and logic with a more systematic scientific eye, encountered these puzzles in a different register. The Stoics did not accept paradox as a quirk of grammar to be settled by ad hoc tricks. They tried to ground truth in a theory of cognition and of impression, a theory in which the mind's encounter with the world is mediated by impressions, phantasia, and where true judgment, katalepsis, arises when an impression is in a proper and fitting relation to the external world. The Stoics developed a sophisticated theory of linguistic content as something that can be measured against the facts of reality, but they also admitted a crucial complication. Language sometimes lands us in situations where the content seems to demand contradictory truth values. In their hands, the paradox is not simply a problem of self-reference. It becomes a stress test for the very idea that saying something about the world is tantamount to making a claim that can be evaluated as true or false in a straightforward, unproblematic way. There are two layers to the Stoic response that deserve emphasis. The first is a general commitment to a functional theory of truth, one that tries to connect truth with the adequacy of our cognitive tendency to classify appearances as aligned with reality. The second is a robust attention to the conditions of language use in a world of competing statements. The Stoics thought that truth is not merely a matter of stating a proposition that, in isolation, corresponds to the state of affairs. Truth arises in the context of judgments, in how well a proposition is integrated into a system of beliefs that one uses to navigate the world. In this sense, the Stoic approach is practical. It is less concerned with whether every sentence has a fixed, global truth value, and more concerned with whether our sentences yield reliable guidance about action, given the impressions we experience and the objects they refer to. A revealing anecdote about the early Stoics concerns Chrysippus, one of the most influential figures in their circle. Chrysippus is often portrayed as the philosopher who expanded the Stoic program into a full-fledged logic that could handle propositions, conditionals, and the test of truth in daily life. If the paradox shattered the confidence that a sentence could neatly divide into true or false, Chrysippus wanted to salvage a working theory that would allow language to function in the presence of multiple, perhaps competing, reports about the same situation. In a world of conflicting statements, some saying one thing, others saying something else, the Stoic method was to appeal to the governing standards by which agreements and disagreements are adjudicated. The idea was not to deny that self-reference creates tension, but to insist that a sentence must be evaluated in a way that respects the conditions under which a statement can be true in relation to what the appearance or impression promises to tell us about reality. Thus, if a proposition has a content that coexists with other propositions in a system of assessments, the Stoics would seek a criterion of truth that remains robust even when language is crowded with competing claims. These Stoic attempts to reconcile language with a functional theory of truth are not simply a lab exercise. They have real consequences for how one uses language in everyday life, how one interprets testimony, and how one distinguishes between merely apparent truth and truth as it bears upon action. The paradox becomes a test case for a theory of language rather than a mere puzzle about self-reference. When you push the boundaries of ordinary speech, you discover that there is a boundary to the reach of language as a tool for describing the world. The boundary is not simply a defect to be repaired. It is a sign that truth, in the Stoic sense, is a practice of aligning signs with things, a practice that is perpetually tested by situations in which many speech acts compete for attention. An essential part of the historical story is to hear the two classic, concrete examples that have shaped our intuition about paradoxes. The first is the classic liar sentence. This sentence is false. If you utter such a sentence and you are committed to the idea that truth values are absolute and well-defined for every proposition, you meet the paradox head-on. If the sentence is true, then it asserts its own falsity, so it must be false. But if it is false, then it is true, since it asserts that it is false. The logic of the sentence seems to demand that it be both true and false at the same time, which is precisely what a paradox is supposed to resist. The second example comes from Epimenides the Cretan, whose age and reputation hover around a different but related form of self-reference. All Cretans are liars. If all Cretans lie, then Epimenides' own statement about his fellow Cretans, without immediate qualification, implies that it too could be a lie, and if it is a lie, maybe some Cretans tell the truth at times, including Epimenides himself. The paradox here is not about a sentence declaring, "I am false," in so many words, but about a general claim about the nature of a people's truthfulness, and about the reliability of reported statements within that community. If Epimenides is lying when he says all Cretans lie, perhaps not all Cretans lie, but if some Cretans sometimes tell the truth, then the claim could still be true as an assertion about a subset rather than an absolute rule. The paradox pushes us to ask a precise question: what exactly do we mean by truthfulness, and what exactly do we mean by lying? Is lying a universal property of a class of speakers, or a property of specific utterances in specific contexts? And if we talk about a person's general disposition to lie, what counts as evidence, and how do cultural and linguistic frameworks shape what counts as a lie? The semantic and the logical dimensions of truth and falsity reveal themselves in these questions. The semantic reading says, truth is a property of sentences related to facts and content. A sentence is true if its content corresponds to the state of affairs in the world, or if its relation to the world is mediated by a truth-conditional structure that maps to the facts. The liar sentence destabilizes that picture because the sentence's content seems to refer to its own truth value as part of the facts that it allegedly describes, or at least as part of what it says about its own truth. The logical reading says, given a fixed set of truth-functional rules, if a sentence asserts its own falsity, the system yields a contradiction, and something in the structure of the logic must give way, either by declaring the sentence neither true nor false, by allowing a third value, or by reinterpreting the language in a way that avoids the self-reference in the first place. The Stoics leaned toward a more pragmatic approach. They were willing to acknowledge that impressions could be true or false, and that judgment depends on the fit between the impression and the thing itself. But they would resist treating every self-referential claim as a legitimate proposition that could bear the weight of truth conditions in a simple yes or no fashion. Across these early developments, the two classical variants are not mere curiosities. They are demonstrations of the fragility of naive assumptions about truth and about how language encodes or represents the world. The Epimenidean version of a universal claim about a people's lying tendencies shows how a general statement about a group can produce a cascade of questions about whether such a universal is even coherent, whether it allows for exceptions, and whether truth itself can be captured by generalizations that are simply too broad to be defended in ordinary speech. The liar sentence, by contrast, is the most straightforward self-reference that resists easy labeling. It is a single sentence that appears to claim the opposite of what it claims about itself, and thus it invites a direct test of whether there can be a ground for truth in such an enclosed structure. The juxtaposition of these two forms, self-enclosing mass of self-reference and generalized claims about a community, helps us to see that paradoxes can arise from different depths of language. One from the reflexive structure of a sentence about itself, another from the social, pragmatic, and semantic depth of linguistic generalization. In trying to map these puzzles to the world of early thought, we should not forget the republic of arguments that surrounded them. The early logic and philosophy of Greece was a republic in the sense that ideas traveled, were translated, revised, and contested across towns, schools, and hedged discussions in public forums. The paradox did not lie in isolation. It thrived in dialogue. When an interlocutor presented a paradox, it was not just about catching someone in a clever trap. It was about prompting a more careful articulation of what a claim means, what it takes for a claim to be true, and how we distinguish a genuine truth from a linguistic accident or a semantic illusion. The paradox becomes, in this sense, a teacher's tool for sharpening reasoning and for drawing attention to the hidden presuppositions that accompany our everyday speech. If we now turn our gaze to how this conversation unfolds in the ancient sources themselves, we encounter the first wave of cross-references that will haunt later generations. The ancient lists of philosophers, documentary artifacts that told the story of who mattered and why, often singled out Eubulides as the adept who could conjure paradox after paradox with what seems like effortless skill. In such lists, he is described as the master of paradox, a phrase that simultaneously honors his ingenuity and signals the caution with which his contemporaries regarded his results. In the pages of Diogenes Laertius and in the scattered fragments that later scholars gathered, Eubulides is not simply a footnote. He is a landmark. The phrase, master of paradox, is not only a label. It is a signal about the enduring appeal and danger of self-referential puzzles. The reputation has a life of its own. It invites students to imitate him, to chase the satisfaction of outwitting a presumed ordinary truth condition, and to risk the deeper trouble of what truth might require of us when language bends back on itself. The historical anecdote of the Stoics amplifies that sense of historical tension. The Stoics did not abandon the project of making sense of truth, they refined it. Chrysippus, in particular, emerges in the tradition as a figure who tried to systematize a theory of judgment and truth that could absorb paradox without collapsing. The anecdotal portrait of Chrysippus is one of disciplined patience and imaginative formalization. He is said to have organized a logic that could adjudicate contested claims by appealing to the structure of propositions and to the conditions of their attachment to facts. The Stoic strategy, in short, was to build a language-preserving theory of truth that would not crumble under self-reference, while at the same time remaining sensitive to the social and practical dimensions of assertion. They built, in a sense, a theory of language as a tool for coping with a world where many things could be stated in many ways, and where the truth of those statements depended partly on how well they served the agent's practical aims and the shared standards of the community. To go a little deeper into the Stoic method, consider the notion of cataleptic impressions, a central feature of their theory of knowledge and truth. An impression is cataleptic when it is clear and capable of being apprehended by the mind in such a way that it bears upon a belief with sufficient force to secure assent. Truth for the Stoics is not a cold, detached correspondence between a sentence and a fact in isolation. It is a matter of the reliability of the cognitive process by which a person comes to assent to a proposition. In this framework, a paradox such as the liar sentence would be seen as a challenge to the reliability of the cognitive process, a challenge to the idea that there exists a simple, global criterion of truth that applies to every sentence in a vacuum. The Stoics would ask, what is the intention behind the sentence? What is the context in which it is uttered? How does its content relate to the actor's beliefs? And how do those beliefs align with the facts that are accessible through perception and reasoning? Even more pointedly, they would ask whether we should treat truth as an internal property of a belief or judgment, or as something that stands in an external relation to the world through a network of signification and reference. In a sense, the Stoic approach reorients the paradox. It suggests that some of the trouble arises not because truth is incoherent in itself, but because language has been misused or misinterpreted in a particular situation. If the environment of discourse is crowded with contradictory claims, how do we assess the reliability of any given claim? The Stoics would respond by refining the criteria for judging judgments, by distinguishing between impressions and judgments, and by appealing to a shared framework within which truth claims can be weighed against the risks of error. The paradox then becomes a test case for a practical, living theory of truth rather than a pure puzzle for logicians to solve. This shift from a linguistic puzzle to a problem about truth, language, and metalanguage begins a trajectory that will dominate later discussions in semantic theory and logic for centuries. Now, beyond these early discussions, a number of important implications arise, which we can trace forward to later developments while still remaining centered in the ancient story. First, the paradox forces us to distinguish two important tasks, semantics and protologic. Semantics concerns what we mean by truth in ordinary language, how sentences attach to states of affairs, and how context shapes interpretation. Protologic concerns the rules by which we draw inferences, the patterns by which we could, in principle, test the acceptability of a given claim, and how we might structure a system of sentences so that the truth conditions of some do not destabilize those of others. The liar paradox in that sense is a natural test case for both tasks, a case that invites a dual analysis, a semantic analysis of what truth means in the presence of self-reference, and a logical analysis of how to manage the inference rules that would govern a sentence that asserts its own falsity. The arc from Eubulides to the Stoics is not a straight line, but a conversation that multiplies the options for how to think about truth. The descent into formal logic, the emergence of semantic theory, and the eventual insistence that truth must be treated in a way that can be formalized without undercutting the ability to reason, all take root in the seed planted by these ancient practitioners. The seeds of modern semantical analysis, of possibility of assigning truth values to sentences in a language, of distinguishing the object language from the metalanguage, and of contemplating the hierarchy of truth predicates, begin to germinate here, in that Greek soil. Philosophers in later centuries would revisit Epimenides and Eubulides with a toolkit that was not yet present in their world, a formal theory of truth with explicit rules, a rigorous distinction between truth and falsity sections, and a deep understanding that self-reference is not just a linguistic trick, but a potential mirror for the structure of rational thought itself. Let us take a moment to notice how the two grand directions, the semantic and the logical, recur throughout the discussion of paradox. On the semantic side, you can think of truth as anchored in the relationship between the content of a statement and the facts it purports to describe. The liar in this sense tests whether such a relationship can be consistently maintained when the content of the statement prescribes its own truth value. On the logical side, the paradox invites us to consider what rules govern the combination of statements and the derivation of truth values from them. There is a sense in which the paradox performs a double duty. It is a diagnostic tool for the semantics of language, and at the same time a stress test for the stability of a deductive system. This dual movement would become a defining feature of later philosophical and mathematical treatments of truth. It would lead over the centuries to a progression from a concern with linguistic puzzles to a concern with truth as a feature of a formal system, and to the recognition that the self-referential structure of language is inseparable from the processes by which we assess the validity of our own reasoning. If we cast our eye forward to the broader historic arc, we can see how these early discussions prefigure a crucial development. The shift from a problem anchored in ordinary language to a problem about truth, language, and metalanguage. This is not merely a change in topic, but a change in level. It is no longer enough to ask whether a particular utterance is true or false in a vacuum. The questions begin to involve layers of language about language, and layers about those layers, a step toward the creation of hierarchies of truth predicates. This is the move that you will see more fully in the major semantic and linguistic theories of the modern era, where truth becomes a property that can be studied with explicit formal devices, carefully defined models, and a disciplined approach to how sentences talk about the world and about each other. Now, the reason we don't end the discussion here is not simply to satisfy a historical appetite. It's because the paradox is a hinge, a turning point that connects ancient thought to a long line of philosophical inquiries that reach our own time. One of the most important consequences of the liar paradox is the realization that language, while immensely powerful, is not infallible or self-sufficient. Paradox reveals a vulnerability, that our most cherished tool for representing truth may require a more nuanced approach if we want to preserve the coherence of our discourse. This is precisely why the Stoics wanted to anchor truth in a practical theory of signs and appearances, and why later thinkers insisted on distinguishing the object language from the metalanguage, and why philosophers like Alfred Tarski, Kripke would eventually insist that truth must be treated as a formal property that interacts with the structure of the language itself, rather than as an unsystematized, all-encompassing gloss on reality. There is a kind of hush that accompanies the exploration of paradox, a hush that invites a patient listening to the subtle boundary lines between saying and being. The paradox does not merely mock our confidence in language. It invites us to cultivate a more careful habit of speech. It suggests perhaps that truth, whether conceived as a property of sentences, a property of beliefs, or a property of cognitive processes, requires a framework that can absorb, rather than quickly swallow, self-reference. That is why the earliest thinkers did not discard paradox as a failure of logic. They treated it as a diagnostic key to the way language organizes, constrains, and sometimes misleads the mind about how the world truly is. As we move through the landscape of these ideas, we can sense the outline of a future map. The next sections will take you beyond the ancient monastery of paradox to where formal theories of truth begin to take shape, to a sense of hierarchy in truth predicates, to the problem of language about language, and to the ways in which philosophers and logicians would attempt to preserve the sense that sentences can remain meaningful without surrendering to insoluble contradictions. The conversation would evolve from a focus on self-referential sentences to a broader, more general theory about truth and language, and in doing so would reveal the lineage that connects Epimenides and Eubulides to Frege and Tarski, to Kripke and his fixed points, to logics that tolerate inconsistency and yet preserve useful reasoning. The throughline is chronological and thematic, from the birthplace of paradox in ancient Greece to the emergence of a more sophisticated logic of truth, and from a narrow linguistic puzzle to a wide-ranging inquiry into how truth is to be understood in the human mind and in human languages. In this spirit, we can imagine a thread that runs from the ancient classroom to the modern computer lab, from a teacher in a public square asking his students to consider a sentence that says it itself is false, to a software engineer who asks whether a program can declare a statement about its own correctness and whether that declaration can be consistent with the program's behavior in every environment. The thread is not simply about solving a paradox, but about understanding what the paradox reveals. That truth is a concept that must be treated with care, that language is a living instrument whose power is matched by responsibility, and that the questions Eubulides posed are not quaint relics but enduring prompts to think more clearly, to reason more carefully, and to talk with more precision about what we mean when we call something true. In closing this segment, I want to give you a sense of how the trajectory from the birth of paradox to the first serious attempts to reconcile language with truth would unfold, and why it matters. The liar paradox will always be more than a puzzle about a single sentence. It will be a test case that invites us to examine the relationship between language and reality, to distinguish what is about the structure of our speech from what is about the world itself, and to ask how we can preserve meaningful discourse in the presence of self-reference. The Epimenidean variant asks us to consider not just what statements say about the world, but what they say about communities and norms, and what it would mean to call a statement about a group a truth-bearing assertion. The Eubulidean liar pose, in its insistence on self-reference, asks us to consider the possibility that language can talk about its own truth conditions in such a way that no simple true-false dichotomy suffices. The Stoics, in turn, remind us that truth is not a purely abstract property, but a practice, a way of aligning our judgments with appearances, with reasons, with the standards of coherence that govern a shared life of inquiry. As you prepare for the next part of this journey, you might allow yourself to imagine a ladder. Each rung is a step toward a more careful theory of truth, and paradoxes are not mere traps but the rungs themselves, enabling ascent. The ladder begins with Eubulides, the master of paradox, and with Epimenides, whose general claim about Crete invites a deep dive into the limits of universal generalizations. It continues with Chrysippus and the Stoics, who sought to repair language by rooting truth in a functional theory of impressions and judgments, in a world where many voices may speak at once. And then in the great arc of history, the ladder climbs into the modern era, where the ladder becomes a scaffold for formal semantics and logic, for truth predicates and hierarchies, for Kripke's fixed points, and for the syntactic theories that would shape our understanding of what it means for a sentence to be true in a given language. You will see in the pages that follow how that throughline unfolds step by step, how the ancient questions give rise to a more intricate architecture of truth, and how the philosophical habit of asking, "What do we really mean when we say this?" remains as vital as ever. The historical genesis of the liar paradox is not a closed chapter. It is a living invitation to keep thinking, to keep listening to the quiet intelligence of paradox, and to keep asking how far language can travel before it must return to the shore of clear meaning. The journey through origins, key thinkers, arguments, counter-arguments, and the cross-references to the later developments is not a mere chronology. It is a way of mapping the moral and intellectual terrain that underwrites rational discourse, the terrain upon which we navigate the delicate, often perilous relationship between what we say, what we mean, and what the world allows us to claim about it. If you listen for the voices behind these ideas, you will hear in the cadence of their voices a shared human anxiety, the fear of saying something that cannot be warranted, of declaring a truth that would collapse the moment you step back to inspect it, of binding yourself to a sentence that refuses to stay within the safe boundaries of true or false. But you will also hear a stubborn, patient confidence that by naming the problem clearly, by articulating the conditions under which utterances count as true, and by seeing how self-reference presses language to its edge, we might craft a more reliable instrument for navigating truth. We might even in time learn to think with the paradox rather than merely suffer it, to harness its energy to refine our own understanding of what it means to speak about truth, to speak about ourselves, and to speak about the world around us. This then is the opening chapter of our exploration, a story rooted in the crowded plazas and syllogistic rooms of ancient Greece, told with the calm, reflective intention of Snooze philosophy. It is a story about a handful of questions that refuse to be settled by a quick answer, a story about the way a sentence can be both a mirror and a trap, a story that will lead us toward a more precise and more generous understanding of truth, language, and the mind. As we proceed, we will trace the paths of argument from the first paradoxes to later semantic theories, and we will follow how the same questions that stirred Eubulides continue to stir thought today. The aim is not merely to memorize what each thinker said, but to absorb the spirit of inquiry that underwrites their inquiries. A disciplined curiosity about the boundaries of language, a willingness to hold two apparently conflicting claims in view at once, and a patient insistence that clarity is earned, not assumed. This is how we begin to move from the ancient genesis of the liar paradox into the modern, alive conversation about truth, language, and the meshwork of meaning that binds them together. The liar paradox has a way of slipping into the room like a quiet whisper that grows louder the longer you listen. It asks us to imagine a sentence that proclaims its own falsity, and in so doing it unsettles our most basic intuitions about truth. If a sentence is true, then what it says about the world is the case. If it is false, then what it says is not the case. And if a sentence is about truth itself, we have a loop that can spiral into contradiction. This section is about formal theories of truth, the ways philosophers have tried to cut that loop cleanly, and how those theories aim to separate truth, falsity, and self-reference without abandoning rigorous analysis. We will proceed with a structured roadmap, one that takes us from Tarski's semantic theory, through the idea of a hierarchical ladder that blocks self-application of the truth predicate, to Kripke's fixed-point theory that accepts partial truth values and the distinction between grounded and ungrounded sentences. We will explore explicit examples, hear the voices of history, consider counterarguments, and connect these ideas to broader debates in deflationary theories, Gödel's incompleteness, and the wider field of formal semantics. Let us begin by setting the stage with the three milestones of this roadmap. First, Tarski's semantic theory of truth, with the crucial insight that truth predicates must be defined in a metalanguage rather than within the same language that they purport to discuss. The tension here is that the liar paradox seems to be a problem of self-reference within a single language, so if truth is to be treated rigorously, we must lift the discourse to a higher language, a metalanguage, where a truth predicate can talk about the sentences of the object language without endangering the consistency of the theory. The second milestone is the notion of a truth hierarchy, the idea that by organizing languages into layers, each with its own truth predicate that talks about the layer below, we can block the self-application that produces paradox. The third milestone is Kripke's fixed-point theory of truth, which accepts that some sentences may not settle into true or false values, and that a partial, staged evaluation can yield a stable picture in which sentences are either grounded, their truth value is determined, or ungrounded, they remain in a kind of open, unfinished state. Kripke's framework brings in the language and model-theoretic perspective and opens the door to possible world semantics as part of a broader semantic enterprise. As we travel, we will bring the theory to life with two core illustrative examples. The first is a formal liar embedded in a language that has its own truth predicate, and where we also have a separate metalanguage that can be used to evaluate that truth predicate. The second is a sentence that resists evaluation altogether, a sentence that ends up in a gap value under Kripke's semantics. These will be more than slogans or abstractions. They will be living demonstrations of how these theories aim to disentangle the knot of self-reference from the tangle of truth. We will also weave in historically resonant anecdotes. There is the long arc of Tarski's pioneering work on the semantics of truth in the 1930s and 1940s, the era when the formalization of mathematics and logic was pressing against deep questions about truth and meaning. There is Kripke's development of a language and model-theoretic approach in the late 20th century, a shift that moved the discussion from purely semantic concerns to a robust model-theoretic framework and helped to illuminate the role of possible worlds. And there is the broader shift from treating truth as a fixed, all-encompassing property of a language to treating it as something that may be staged, layered, and in some contexts partial. In telling these stories, we will also note counterarguments that critics raise. On one side, the hierarchy and Kripke approach avoid inconsistency, but complicate naive notions of truth in natural language. On the other, these theories, while technically impressive, still leave open challenging questions about truth for ordinary discourse, mathematics, and the intersection of truth with practice. We will cross-reference to deflationary theories, to Gödel's incompleteness, and to the broader field of formal semantics to keep the map rich and navigable. let us begin with Tarski, the cradle of semantic truth. Tarski was not content to accept truth as a vague, all-purpose gloss that would somehow capture the whole of reality with a single sweeping predicate. Instead, he insisted that truth must be defined with care, using the structure of formal languages and the discipline of a metalanguage that can speak about the sentences of the object language without collapsing into paradox. The core move is deceptively simple in its elegance. Recognize that if we have a language L that contains a truth predicate T, and we allow T to talk about sentences of L, we have a potential paradox waiting to unfold. But if we keep T in a higher metalanguage M, and we define truth for sentences of L in terms of the actual facts rather than in terms of T's own self-application within L, then we can articulate a robust schema that preserves coherence. To follow closely Tarski's own guidance, imagine a formal language L that has a set of sentences about, say, arithmetic, and in addition a sentence form that allows us to say that a particular sentence P in L is true. In the classic formulation there is a T-schema. A sentence of the object language L, say P, is true if and only if P is the case. In symbols, for every sentence P of L, the statement P is true if and only if P. Or more compactly, P is true if P. This is the T-schema that has become the font of practical work in the semantic theory of truth. But crucially, this T-schema cannot be proven or validated within L itself. To be meaningful and non-circular, it must be accepted in a metalanguage M that stands outside L. The metalanguage is the lens through which truth in L is gazed at and described. It is the place where the truth conditions live, and it is here that paradox can be avoided. Tarski's project was both technical and deeply philosophical. He argued that the paradox arises because one tries to define truth for sentences of L using a truth predicate that belongs to the same language L. The cure, in his view, is both simple and radical. The truth predicate must be defined in a language that is strictly more powerful than the language under study, a metalanguage, and the truth conditions for sentences of the object language must be given by the semantics of that metalanguage. This separation is not a mere technical trick, it is a conceptual commitment about what truth is and how it is to be handled in a rigorous theory. We can quote him in spirit as he put it in his influential essays. A sentence in the object language is true if and only if it expresses a true proposition, and this truth criterion is captured in the metalanguage by the T-schema. The important move is not to deny the phenomenon of truth, but to insist that its correct treatment requires a hierarchy of languages, each with its own role, and the truth predicate of one language can only speak about sentences of the language below it. To appreciate the force and the elegance of this move, let us consider a concrete illustration, akin to what Tarski himself would have imagined. In a language L that contains a truth predicate T, we might try to form the sentence, "This sentence is true." If we attempt to evaluate this within L, we are immediately confronted by a potential circularity. The sentence talks about its own truth, and the truth predicate is living in the same language. If we attempt to evaluate it with a T-schema in L itself, we get into trouble. The remedy is to step upward to M, the metalanguage, where a sentence of L can be talked about in a way that does not re-enter L and refer to its own truth predicate. In M, we can express something like, "The sentence, this sentence is true, but we must be careful here. The truth of that assertion in M depends on the semantics of L, not on any self-referential circularity within L." This separation ensures that the liar cannot wreak havoc inside L itself, while still permitting a robust, formal notion of truth to be defined for the sentences of L. Now, how does this play out with a precise, crafted example? Suppose we have a formal language L that includes a sentence S that is the L-king of paradox. S is not true. In L, we add a truth predicate TL that can talk about the truth of sentences of L. If we try to treat S in L as a closed loop, S asserts S is not true, and then we attempt to evaluate it using TL within L, we find that there is no consistent truth value within L itself. If S is true, then S is not true. If S is false, then S is true. A paradox arises. Enter the metalanguage M, where we can discuss S and speech about S without letting TL enter the same loop. In M, we can state the T-schema for S. S is true in L if and only if S is the case in the object language, but we do not allow TL to speak about S inside L. We place the truth condition for S in M and anchor it to the standard semantics of the language L. In this sense, the paradox is refracted outward. The paradox remains in the cross-language dialogue, but it ceases to be a problem within L itself because L does not contain the machinery to generate the paradox on its own. The key move is that truth, to be well-behaved, is defined in a language that itself does not contain the full reflexive power to talk about its own truth in the same breath. This picture, which Tarski champions, has an important practical consequence. It creates a structured way to analyze and avoid self-reference that cultivates paradox. It does not deny that truth is a meaningful notion. Rather, it constrains the domain in which the truth predicate operates. We gain a precise, workable account of truth from mathematical and formal languages, while acknowledging that the price of such precision is a more complex architecture, an architecture of languages, layers, and metalanguages, rather than a single, all-encompassing truth object. It is not simply a matter of saying, truth exists in natural language and cannot cause trouble. The more accurate claim is that truth for formalized discourse must be defined in a way that respects disciplined limits. Truth predicates belong to a higher-order domain, the metalanguage, and the sentences of the object language must be assigned truth values by definitions that do not embed the truth predicate within the same language. To speak of Tarski in his own historical context is to read him as part of a broader project in the mid-20th century, the project to bring mathematics, logic, and semantics into a rigorous alignment. This is where anecdote enriches the intellectual mood. Tarski's most celebrated work in this vein came in the 1930s and 1940s, during a period of breathtaking energy in the logic of mathematics. In that era, he produced a sequence of papers and essays that articulated the semantic conception of truth for formalized languages. He was part of a generation of logicians who were rewriting the foundations of mathematics, who were asking not just whether a theory could prove theorems, but what it meant for sentences to be true or false within a given formal structure. His work was not merely technical, it was a conceptual move that reoriented how philosophers understood truth. He faced the political and intellectual storms of his time, wars, upheavals, and shifts across continents, but his insistence on metalanguages and T-schemas persisted as a lasting contribution. It is easy to hear a sense of his steady, patient voice in those writings. Truth is not a wild, free-floating property. It is something that must be anchored in a carefully delineated hierarchy of languages, and the paradox must be framed in terms that stay within the bounds of formal definition. As we turn toward the second milestone in our roadmap, we move from the tidy, procedural clarity of a metalanguage-based truth to a broader, more layered strategy, the truth hierarchy. If the problem is that self-reference within a single language yields paradox, a natural move is to restrict the reach of the truth predicate by placing it in a language that cannot be used to analyze its own rules. The truth hierarchy is built by stacking languages, L0, lone, Eltwo, and so on, each with its own truth predicate that talks about the level beneath it but not about itself. In this laddered approach, the paradoxical sentence that says, "This sentence is not true" can, in principle, exist at some level, but it is not allowed to refer to its own truth predicate in the same way that would generate the paradox. The effect is to block self-application at each step of the hierarchy. To make this concrete, imagine we start with a base language L0, which contains the usual arithmetic or whatever formal content you want, but does not contain a general truth predicate. Then we introduce lone, which extends L0 with a truth predicate tone that can talk about sentences of L0. Crucially, tone is not allowed to speak about sentences of lone itself. It speaks only about the truth of statements in L0. Any sentence of lone that mentions tone must be about the truth of an L0 sentence, not about the truth of a sentence in lone. Therefore, the classic liar, "This sentence in lone is not true," cannot be constructed in lone in a way that makes the paradox reemerge. The statement referring to its own truth would require a tone within lone that does precisely what lone forbids. To talk about its own truth. By design, the self-referential trap is avoided because the truth predicate of each level only looks downward to the level immediately below it. Carrying this forward, we can imagine Eltwo, which contains its own truth predicate Titwo that can discuss truths of sentences of lone, and so on. The pattern is clear. No sentence in LK can be used to articulate the truth of sentences of LK itself. To talk about the truth of LK, we have to ascend to LK plus 1, where a different truth predicate operates. If we insist on continuing the hierarchy through transfinite steps, L0, lone, Eltwo, and beyond, we can in principle accommodate an indefinitely rich language and a hierarchy of truth predicates, where the possibility of paradox is systematically contained rather than resolved by a single, blanket truth predicate that pretends it can talk about itself without any restriction. This approach has been deeply influential, and it has been developed and clarified in various variants. One way to summarize the idea is this. If you allow a truth predicate to apply to only the level below, you prevent a sentence from forming self-referential loops with the very predicate that is supposed to adjudicate its truth. Paradox shrinks away, or at least becomes a problem at a higher tier rather than within the same tier where it would cause trouble. The hierarchy makes truth a layered phenomenon rather than a single monolithic property. It also dovetails with a broader move in logic and semantics toward a modular architecture. There are formulas of truth that talk about truths, but they are always future or past the level where the self-reference would occur. Two vivid illustrative examples help illuminate this. The first is an explicit formal liar in a language with a truth predicate and a separate metalanguage to evaluate it. The second is the type of non-evaluatable sentence that Kripke's framework will handle by placing it in a gap value. Example A, the formal liar in a language with a truth predicate and a separate metalanguage. Consider L0, the base language containing arithmetic and a set of sentences P0, pone, pitwo, and so forth, none of which talk about truth. Then introduce loan, which adds a truth predicate tone for sentences of L0. Now consider a sentence in loan that is designed to play the role of a liar about L0. Let's say the sentence L that says, loan is not true. But loan is, by design, allowed only to talk about truth of sentences of L0. It cannot talk about loan is true or loan is false inside loan because such talk would be an appeal to the truth predicate at the same level, which is not permitted by the hierarchy. In the metalanguage M, where we talk about L0 and loan together, we can present the truth of L0 sentences using tone, and we can discuss loan's claim with full clarity, but only with reference to L0 sentences and their truth values. In M, we can interpret loan as asserting or denying something about L0's truths, not about its own status as a sentence. If we take a concrete L0 sentence like 2 plus 2 equals 4, which is true in standard arithmetic, then the sentence in loan that says the sentence 2 plus 2 equals 4 is a true assertion in M, and the sentence 2 plus 2 equals 4 is not true is a false assertion in M. But the critical point is that the paradoxical self-reference in loan, if it were allowed, would require loan to talk about itself in a way that would embed self-reference within loan's own truth predicate. The hierarchy blocks this. To talk about the truth of loan sentences, one uses L2, which in turn can talk about loan truths, but not about loan's ability to talk about its own truth. The paradox does not vanish, but it becomes a problem of a higher tier to be settled by the rules of that tier, not by the interior logic of loan alone. In this example, we have kept the paradox at bay by separating the levels of discourse. The metalanguage M serves as the arena where truth is defined across levels. It is not that there is no paradox anywhere. Rather, the paradox is refracted into the meta-structure of the hierarchy. The ground rules of the hierarchy, by design, prevent a chain of self-reference that would close on itself in a single language. The artifact remains real. We have a robust, non-self-referential account of truth for L0 and loan, and the difficult liar sentence, if it tries to operate entirely within loan, cannot be formed in a way that leads to contradiction within that level. If we want to explore more, if we want to interrogate the truth of sentences at loan, we ascend to L2 and then to L3 as necessary. The hierarchy ensures continuity of meaning and the preservation of consistency by distributing tasks among levels rather than collapsing them into a self-referential loop. This is precisely the kind of move that many philosophers find appealing when they wish to rescue a notion of truth from paradox, while maintaining a rigorous formal structure that can be used in mathematics, computer science, and formal linguistics. It is both incisive and pragmatic. It acknowledges the difficulties posed by self-reference and responds with an architectural solution rather than a purely semantic rearrangement. The truth hierarchy is a blueprint for building languages and their semantics like a multi-story building. The floors support the stories above, but they are not allowed to be self-contained within any single floor. The structure is designed so that truth for each floor is defined in terms of the floor below, with the understanding that higher floors can speak about the truth in lower floors, but cannot trap themselves on lower floors through self-referential self-application. To appreciate the human side of this turn, consider an anecdote from the history of logic and philosophy that helps illuminate what such a hierarchy buys us. In the mid to late 20th century, logicians began to see how the semantic paradoxes might be reframed in terms of levels of language, not just in terms of a qualitative notion of truth. The move toward a hierarchy aligns with the broader current in philosophy and theoretical computer science toward modular, layered formal systems. It is an intellectual gesture toward the practical reality that truth, in mathematics and formal languages, sometimes must be controlled, localized, and stratified if we want to avoid runaway paradox while preserving the capacity to talk meaningfully about truth at the level where it is safe to do so. In this sense, the truth hierarchy is a concrete, implementable strategy. It provides a template for constructing languages whose semantic features can be tested, manipulated, and reasoned about without fear of circular snares. Turning now to the third milestone, the Kripkean fixed-point theory of truth, let us move beyond the aspiration of purely avoiding paradox by hierarchical constraint and toward a theory that accepts that some sentences may not settle into a classical true or false value. Saul Kripke's theory, developed in the late 20th century, treats truth predicates as potentially partial. Some sentences are true, some false, and some remain in limbo, not true and not false. The central idea is to define truth in terms of a fixed point of a semantic evaluation that proceeds in stages. Each stage produces a provisional assignment of truth values to sentences based on what can be determined from earlier stages. Sentences are then re-evaluated in light of those assignments, and this process continues, potentially transfinitely, until a fixed point is reached where no more changes occur. The crucial distinction Kripke introduces is between grounded sentences and ungrounded sentences. Grounded sentences have their truth truthfully determined by the content of the sentences below the truth predicate. Ungrounded sentences, by contrast, do not have a determinate truth value determined by the current stage. To see how this plays out, let us first describe the rough architecture of Kripke's semantics. We begin with a language that includes a truth predicate T, but unlike the simple Tarski-style approach, truth is not defined by a single, global predicate that applies to all sentences in one go. Instead, we borrow the idea of a staged evaluation. In stage 0, we assign truth values to a subset of sentences whose truth can be determined without appealing to the truth of sentences that themselves reference truth. In stage 1, we use the truth of stage 0 sentences to determine the truth of sentences that refer to those stage 0 truths, and so on. At each stage, sentences that rely on self-reference in a way that cannot yet be settled are left in a kind of suspense. After transfinitely many stages, we reach a stage where no further sentences can be pushed to a new truth value. This is the fixed point. A particularly illuminating way to picture the fixed point method is to imagine a conversation about truth that proceeds in rounds. In round 0, we declare everything that is obviously true or false based on non-self-referential content. We leave sentences that refer to truth in a self-referential way undecided. In round 1, we use the information from round 0 to decide more sentences, but still we leave some unresolved. In round 2, we push even more sentences toward truth or falsity, again depending on earlier rounds. The process continues. In many cases, particularly with the classic liar sentence, a sentence can become ungrounded in every stage. That is, no stage assigns a truth value to it. It remains in the gap between truth and falsity. Kripke's result is subtle but powerful. It explains how a language can contain a truth predicate and yet avoid a full assignment of truth values to all sentences, not by denying truth faculties, but by acknowledging that some sentences do not settle. A key technical distinction in Kripke's approach is that of grounded versus ungrounded sentences. Grounded sentences have their truth values determined by the content of sentences that are themselves grounded. They do not owe their status to a circular passage through the truth predicate. Ungrounded sentences depend on the behavior of the truth predicate itself, and thus they may fail to stabilize at any finite stage. They remain in a liminal state, a gap value that Kripke's three-valued logic assigns to such sentences. Consider, as a canonical instance for our discussion, the sentence S. S is not true. In Kripke's framework, S begins its life at the initial stage without a decision about its truth value. If the evaluation process never assigns a definite truth or falsity to S, it remains ungrounded. A sentence of the general form, "this sentence is not true," becomes the paradigmatic case of a sentence that fails to stabilize in Kripke's sense. It is neither true nor false in the final fixed point. It sits in the gap. Kripke's theory is not merely a way to avoid paradox. It is a recognition that natural language and some formal languages may harbor sentences that resist classical truth predicates. The fixed point approach allows truth to be a partial predicate, a feature that resonates with intuition about vagueness and indeterminacy in ordinary discourse, while preserving mathematical rigor. The price is that truth becomes a more complicated, layered notion, one that does not always yield crisp binary truths for every sentence. But Kripke's framework returns to us a robust language and model-theoretic perspective. If we frame truth as a function of a model and a fixed-point construction, we can handle self-reference in a controlled, principled way. and we can preserve the idea that some statements may be beyond the reach of truth yet still meaningful as sentences of the language. Among the historical threads that inform Kripke's approach is the shift from a purely semantic problem to a model-theoretic, potential world-informed account of truth. Kripke's fixed-point theory of truth sits at a crossroads. It inherits from the semantic tradition the insistence that truth is governed by truth conditions, but it also aligns with the model-theoretic tradition that allows truth to be evaluated in terms of possible worlds or structures. In Kripke's hands, truth becomes something that can be studied in terms of fixed points of a monotone operator on sets of sentences, where the operator encodes the way sentences are determined by the truth of other sentences. The move toward a model-theoretic lens helps connect the liar paradox to issues about the nature of truth in formal systems and to questions about the limits of formalization itself. The broader horizon is visible. Kripke's program invites us to think of truth as a dynamic, layered relation among sentences, truth predicates, and the environments in which those sentences are interpreted. If you listen closely to Tarski and Kripke together, you hear a conversation across generations that shows the evolution of the philosophy of truth. Tarski lays down the problem with a crisp, technical clarity. You cannot define the truth predicate for a language inside that language without running into self-reference. You must move to a metalanguage, speak truth in terms of that different language, and keep the truth predicate out of the object language. The metalanguage is your safe harbor, your arena where you can speak about truth without inviting the paradox into the heart of your theory. Kripke, writing decades later, agrees that there is a deeper layer to the problem, one that requires you to acknowledge partial truth values and the possibility that some sentences are neither true nor false. He does not reject the idea of a truth predicate. Rather, he reframes truth as a matter that can be partial, staged, and fixed at a point where a coherent semantics emerges. The result is a more flexible, more nuanced account of truth that dialogues with contemporary formal semantics and the language of semantics in linguistics, and it also turns the paradox into a kind of test case for the strength and limits of formalism. As we draw near to a more explicit appraisal of the argument structure of these formal theories, we should also acknowledge counterarguments. First, the hierarchical approach, though effective at blocking self-reference, can be read as complicating naive notions of truth in natural language. Real sentences about everyday life, about social practice, about mathematics or science, do not neatly arrange themselves into a tidy tower of languages, each with its own truth predicate, such that no sentence in one level can talk about its own truth. Our ordinary discourse freely uses sentences that appear to self-reference, not to mention the subtlety of mathematical proofs and the way we talk about them in the same breath as their truth. The hierarchy, while technically elegant, risks producing a picture of truth that feels distant from lived language and from intuitive judgments about truth in ordinary contexts. If we adopt a hierarchical theory wholesale, we might be forced to say that a sentence like, "the current weather is sunny," is simply a truth condition for a sentence in a level L0, and that commentary on the truth or falsity of that weather report requires no less than one more level of discourse. The sense of truth in everyday speech becomes a more complicated, perhaps more awkward, phenomenon than what naive speech would suggest. The hierarchical approach is a way of preserving formal coherence. It may come at the cost of natural language aesthetics and intuitive simplicity. Second, even the most sophisticated formal theories, Tarski's semantic approach, the truth hierarchy, Kripke's fixed-point theory, appear technically adept but still leave open questions about truth in ordinary discourse and in mathematics. Gödel's incompleteness theorem enters the scene as a reminder that no sufficiently powerful formal system can capture all mathematical truths, including perhaps all metatruths about the system itself. Gödel shows that no formalism, no matter how carefully structured, can guarantee that every true statement about the system is provable within the system. This is a profound boundary marker. It tells us that even the most careful, hierarchically organized, or fixed-point theory cannot by itself secure a complete, all-encompassing notion of truth, at least not when truth is identified with provability. The liar becomes more than a paradox to be avoided. It becomes a signpost indicating the limits of formal truth conditions as a totalizing concept. In a sense, Gödel invites us to be humble about the reach of formalism. Truth in mathematics, though it can be sharply delineated within a given theory, may always reach beyond the boundary of what the theory can prove. This leads to an important cross-reference, the deflationary theories of truth. Deflationists insist that truth is a simple, minimal, or schematic notion, an expressive device that allows us to generalize and repeat our sentences without committing to a robust metaphysical property of truth. A deflationary account says that the role of truth in a sentence like snow is white is simply to align the sentence with the proposition it expresses. The sentence is true if snow is white. There is no need for a robust truth property with its own independent semantic burden. Truth is a linguistic convenience. If the deflationary view gets its grip here, it would arguably resist the temptations of a powerful theory of truth designed to resolve paradox through deep semantic architecture. Yet there is a tension. Deflationism may be perfectly compatible with Tarski's idea of a semantic truth predicate defined in a metalanguage, but it might resist attempts to give truth a robust, foundational status that could be used to derive absolute truth conditions for all sentences in a formal theory. The liar on a deflationary reading becomes less a metaphysical riddle and more a demonstration of the limits of truth talk as a semantic tool, a demonstration that in ordinary language we can speak of truth without needing to grant truth a robust, translinguistic status. The map would not be complete without tying these formal theories to the broader field of formal semantics and to the history of logic. The liar paradox is not a mere curiosity of philosophy. It has driven substantial progress in formal semantics, in the development of model theory, and in the articulation of the limits of formal systems. The three milestones, Tarski's metalanguage, the truth hierarchy, and Kripke's fixed-point theory, together provide a robust, if intricate, framework for thinking about truth. They illuminate how logicians and philosophers have approached the paradox from different angles. First, by insisting on separating the levels of discourse to avoid self-reference. Second, by accepting a layered, staged schedule for truth that prevents self-reference from spiraling into contradiction. And third, by acknowledging a genuine possibility that some sentences may resist a two-valued verdict and thus demand a partial, staged, or fixed-point notion of truth. The conversation with Gödel reminds us that the ambition to capture truth within a formal system is necessarily limited in scope, and Kripke's framework helps to reflect that nuance. It recognizes that truth can be partial and that certain sentences refuse to commit to true or false values, even as the system remains coherent. In a broader sense, this conversation about truth helps inform the work of formal semantics and linguistics, where researchers grapple with how the semantics of natural language relates to truth conditions, reference, and context. It is no accident that Kripke's semantic ideas moved out of the purely philosophical and into the domain of linguistics, as we study how language works in the real world. The lying sentence in natural language, "This sentence is not true," has not vanished. It has been reframed with a more careful semantic apparatus that makes room for the possibility that some sentences are not truth-apt in the classical sense, yet can still be meaningful and useful. Let me offer two more concrete illustrative moments that anchor these ideas in the real world of formal reasoning and everyday reflection. First, a more explicit demonstration of the formal liar in a language with a truth predicate and the need to evaluate it in a separate metalanguage. Imagine a laboratory of formal sentences, carefully coded and enumerated. The base language L0 contains arithmetic and perhaps set theoretic expressions. We add a truth predicate tone that can talk about the truth of sentences of L0. Within L0 itself, we might encode a sentence S that says, "S is not true." But this S is not allowed to be evaluated by tone inside L0. If we attempt to interpret S in L0, we would have a danger of paradox. However, if our framework is properly organized, we evaluate the truth of S in the metalanguage M, which can refer to L0's sentences and use tone as needed while keeping the boundaries intact. In M, we can analyze S by asking, does S refer to its own truth value, or does it refer to truth values of statements about L0? If S is formulated to be the assertion that the statement in L0 named the liar is not true, then when we evaluate S in M, we must step outside the self-reference loop that would arise in L0 with tone. The metalanguage provides a way to see that the sentence's truth condition is determined by the truth of a lower-level statement in L0. The paradox dissolves when the evaluation steps out of the self-referential loop. Second, consider Kripke's gap-valued liar sentence, the sentence that falls into a gap value in Kripke semantics. This is not a mere artifact of formalism. It is a genuine phenomenon in models that admit partial truth conditions. In Kripke's framework, we begin with a language that is rich enough to contain a truth predicate and to discuss the truth values of sentences. We then define a staged evaluation where some sentences become true or false through the process, and others remain undecided. The sentence, "This sentence is not true," will not settle at any stage. There is no way for it to be assigned a true or false value without contradicting itself. It remains undefined, a gap value. The demonstration is not a rhetorical flourish. It captures what spiritually or aesthetically one might call a living open question about truth. Some sentences simply cannot be categorized in a binary way by the rules of the language, at least as long as we adopt Kripke's staged evaluation. And yet the theory remains coherent. The fixed-point existence ensures that there is a well-defined semantic structure in which some sentences are true, some false, and some undecided. That is the core payoff of Kripke's move. It respects the ordinary human sense that some truths remain elusive, even within an otherwise carefully formulated theory of truth. With these examples in view, we can turn to a critical assessment, some lines of thought that are often pressed in response to formal theories of truth. The first line is that the hierarchy or Kripke approach, while adept at avoiding paradox, complicates naive notions of truth in natural language. In natural language, we do not ordinarily speak of truth in clean, stacked layers. Our everyday discourse allows self-reference to operate without legalistic scaffolding, and many languages lack the explicit stratified architecture that the formalist would impose for the sake of resolution. In natural language, the lyre-like sentences feel more like puzzles about semantic competence and self-knowledge than about the architecture of a logic. The hierarchy and fixed-point frameworks, if taken too literally as models of ordinary language, risk producing a theory of truth that is too heavy-handed to capture how people actually use truth predicates in daily life or even how mathematics operates in practice. The second line of critique is that, although these theories solve or avoid the paradox in mathematical or formal contexts, they do not fully solve questions about truth in ordinary mathematics and in ordinary discourse. Gödel's incompleteness theorem remains a horizon that cannot be ignored. It tells us that any sufficiently strong formal system is incomplete. There are truths about arithmetic that cannot be captured by any single formal system's proof rules. That is not a paradox in a formal sense in the same way as the liar sentence, but it is a kind of limit that any robust theory of truth must reckon with. If we treat truth as a robust, all-encompassing property of a language or system, Gödel's result warns that we must eventually confront unexplained truths beyond inference within the system. Kripke's framework offers a partial answer. Some sentences will remain ungrounded and thus not assign truth values. But it also raises questions. What about truth in mathematics when a sentence relates to the truth of statements in a higher-level language or to the truth of meta-statements about the theory? In a sense, Gödel pushes us to recognize that the search for a complete, all-encompassing truth predicate might be misguided. A meaningful notion of truth may have to be partial, layered, or context-sensitive. Against these, the defense of formal theories is that they provide clarity and precision for analyzing paradox. They give us tools to handle self-reference, to draw boundaries, and to model the way truth interacts with language, logic, and mathematics. The metalanguage approach avoids inconsistency by keeping the truth predicate in a different language. The hierarchy provides a disciplined architecture, and Kripke's fixed-point theory respects the intuition that not all sentences should be forced into a binary classification. The three approaches together form a robust triad. One part clarifies the requirements for truth in a purely formal setting. One part shows how to restructure discourse so that those requirements can be satisfied in a layered way. And one part accepts the possibility of partial truth about self-referential language while preserving a stable semantic structure. We can round out the discussion by placing these formal theories in a broader philosophical milieu. Deflationary theories remind us that truth might not be a deep metaphysical property to be discovered, but rather a useful feature of language that does the work of endorsement, agreement, and assertion without requiring a robust theory of the ontology of truth. Gödel's incompleteness, far from overthrowing truth, reframes what a comprehensive theory of truth could or should be. The broader field of formal semantics, which extends into linguistics and computer science, pushes truth into the ordinary and practical domains where language interacts with belief, intention, and action. The liar paradox remains a touchstone, a test case that demonstrates where naive expectations about truth falter and where rigorous, carefully structured theories can illuminate the path forward. To summarize, three formal responses to the liar paradox have shaped the landscape of formal theories of truth in decisive ways. First, Tarski's semantic theory insists that truth predicates must be defined in a metalanguage, not in the object language, because the paradox emerges when self-reference within a single language is allowed to exploit the truth predicate. The T-schema P is true if P becomes a guiding axiom for the metalanguage's treatment of truth conditions, and the separation of object language and metalanguage becomes a practical solution to the paradox. Second, the truth hierarchy offers a way to block self-application of truth by layered languages, so that the truth predicate operates only on the level below. The paradox recedes into higher levels rather than emerging within a given level. This provides a clean, structural approach to the liar-like sentences within formal systems, while preserving a rigorous mechanism for evaluating truth across levels. Third, Kripke's fixed-point theory accepts partial truth values and distinguishes between grounded and ungrounded sentences, with a staged evaluation that can converge to a fixed point. The non-evaluatable self-referential sentence S, "This sentence is not true," ends up with a gap value, neither true nor false, in Kripke's semantics, thereby capturing a natural way to accommodate sentences that resist a binary verdict while preserving the coherence of the theory. In closing, we can see that these formal theories, while addressing the liar paradox in robust ways, open up a broader panorama. They connect to deflationary views, show the limits revealed by Gödel's incompleteness, and point toward the rich, evolving field of formal semantics that continues to illuminate the nature of language, truth, and meaning. The liar paradox thus functions not only as a puzzle to be solved, but as a lighthouse to guide us toward a more nuanced appreciation of truth itself. Not a single monolithic essence, but a spectrum of meanings, layers, and values that can be aligned with the structure of language, models, and interpretation. Tarski gives us a disciplined, hierarchical way to define truth in formal languages. The truth hierarchy gives us a scalable architecture for regulating self-reference. Kripke gives us the realism of a partial truth that acknowledges the world of sentences that resist a neat classification. Each contributes to a richer understanding of how we talk about truth, how we construct theories, and how we navigate the delicate interplay between language, logic, and reality. Now, as we step away from the formal apparatus and into the broader patter of the philosophical landscape, let me invite you to hold in view the cross-connections that run through these discussions. Think of deflationary theories as offering a countercurrent. Maybe truth is not the anchor of a deep, hidden metaphysical property, but a linguistic convention that helps us coordinate belief and assertion. Think of Gödel's incompleteness as a reminder that even our most careful systems must acknowledge the possibility that there are truths beyond the reach of any given formal framework. Think of the model theoretic and possible world perspectives as the natural extension of the idea that truth is not a single, static relation, but something that depends on the structure in which sentences are interpreted. And think of formal semantics as the field of study where logicians, linguists, and computer scientists come together to understand how truth behaves in the wild, in natural language, in mathematical reasoning, and in the algorithms that underwrite our automated reasoning. The liar paradox thus remains not a closing puzzle but an opening of a larger inquiry. The three strands we have traced, Tarski's metalanguage, the truth hierarchy, Kripke's fixed-point semantics, are not mutually exclusive. They illuminate different facets of the same problem, and in their conversation, they illuminate the broader field of formal semantics. The journey from semantic to model-theoretic perspectives is not merely a technical shift. It reveals a change in the way we conceive of truth, self-reference, and the very possibility of a comprehensive theory of language. As we move forward in our exploration of the philosophy of truth, keep this in mind. The paradox is not only a challenge to formalization, it is a guide toward a more nuanced, layered, and ultimately more faithful account of truth in language and thought. The story is ongoing and the stakes are not merely theoretical. They touch the core of how we understand mathematics, language, knowledge, and the deep structure of rational discourse. If you've ever wrestled with the liar paradox, the sentence that says of itself that it is false, you know how quickly language can cascade into a forest of contradictions. And yet, the history of logic has repeatedly asked whether contradictions must spell disaster for our understanding of truth, or whether they can be contained, studied, even used to illuminate the structure of reasoning itself. In this section, we turn our attention to two robust families of response that have reshaped contemporary logic and epistemology, paraconsistent logics and dialetheism. The central hinge is simple in idea, even if tricky in execution. They offer pathways that reject or temper the principle of explosion, the idea that from a contradiction you can derive every possible thing. They aim to preserve some sense of rational discourse even when our premises harbor conflicts. Let me begin with the broader frame. The principle of explosion is one of the oldest intuitions we inherit about logic. If A is true and not A is true, then any arbitrary proposition B should follow. In ordinary classical logic, that's exactly what happens. If you accept both a statement and its negation, you should be able to derive everything, which makes contradiction catastrophic for knowledge, science, and communication. The project of paraconsistent logic, however, asks a more stubborn question. Can we have a logic in which some contradictions are tolerated without collapsing into universal entailment? Can we have rational discourse in the presence of inconsistencies without surrendering the very idea that some sentences can guide us and others mislead us? Paraconsistent logic says yes, it can be done. Dialetheism, a more specific stance within that family, says yes in a particular way. Some contradictions are true, not merely false or a sign of flawed reasoning, and we should be prepared to treat certain sentences as true and false at once. To trace the roots of this enterprise, we can imagine a period in the mid-20th century when logicians began to challenge the necessity of a world in which contradictions are fatal to everything. In Brazil during the 1960s, a logician named Newton da Costa and his collaborators began to develop formal systems that deliberately allowed contradictions to remain confined, resisting the urge to explode into trivialism. Da Costa's early work introduced what would come to be called paraconsistent logics, logical systems in which the rule "from A and not A derive everything" is not valid. The spirit was not to celebrate all contradictions, but to regulate their influence so that some truths could survive the presence of others. In a memorable line that has echoed through decades of philosophy of logic, Da Costa and his fellows insisted that contradictory states need not imply the total collapse of reliable inference. They were not naively rebranding truth as something unanchored. They were reconfiguring the architecture of inference so that it could resist the flood of explosion. If we step forward to the English-speaking philosophical scene, we hear a different voice that helped popularize the turn toward paraconsistency. Graham Priest, whose name now sits prominently at the center of discourse about paraconsistent logic, became a central figure by asking hard questions about the very idea of truth when contradictions are present. Priest is associated with the logic of paradox, LP, a three-valued or four-valued semantic framework in which some sentences can be both true and false. The rhetorical force of his approach is to confront the liar in a way that maintains useful distinctions between truth, falsity, and both, rather than dissolving them into a single accidental ruin. In his own words, though spoken with the plainness of a philosopher who loves to push ideas to their limits, Priest has often reminded audiences that a sentence can be both true and false. That compact claim is not a mere curiosity. It is a program that invites us to revise our expectations about truth value, valuation, and the relation between language and reality. To appreciate the shape of paraconsistent and dialetheic responses, it helps to distinguish two central commitments that these traditions share, and also to notice where they diverge. The first is a fundamental relaxation or recalibration of the explosion principle. In a paraconsistent system, the combination of a proposition and its negation does not automatically yield arbitrary conclusions. In a dialectic framework, we go further in a specific direction. Some contradictions are true. The liar can be both true and false, a fact that must be accommodated in the logic itself rather than dismissed as a sign of failure. The second shared thread is the insistence that we can preserve meaningful consequences, guided inference, and normative evaluation, even when contradictions are present. If you permit true contradictions without any guardrails, you risk trivialism, that is, the idea that every sentence becomes knowable or derivable. If you're not careful, you may also face profound epistemic and normative questions. What does it mean to know something in the shadow of a true contradiction? What obligations do we have to avoid spreading inconsistency into domains where it would do real damage? Let's now move from the big picture to two concrete exemplars that illuminate how these ideas function inside a logical system. The first is the logic of paradox, LP, which is often presented as a paradigmatic paraconsistent system. The second is a dialectic framework where the liar sentence is assigned both truth values and treated as a genuine, evaluative element of the system, not an error to be corrected, but a feature to be understood and managed. In both cases, our aim is to see how truth values might be structured, how inference is controlled, and how we might use these tools to model real scenarios in which information is imperfect, conflicting, or self-referential in difficult ways. First, imagine a small, self-contained logical playground built on LP. In LP, sentences can take on three possible states: true, false, or both true and false. The last of these is what makes LP a paraconsistent logic of interest. It allows sentences such as "the liar" to sit without collapsing the entire system into trivialism. Consider the classical liar sentence, L. This sentence is false. In a typical LP setting, what does it mean for L to be true, false, or both? If L is true, then what L says must hold, but L says that it is false, so L being true would entail its own falsity. If L is false, then what L says is not the case, but since L says it is false, L being false would render it true. If L is both true and false, then L asserts its own falsehood, and the system recognizes both the truth of the assertion and the falsity of the assertion. The paradox remains in the sense that L is inseparable from its own claim about truth, but crucially, the surrounding logic does not let this collapse into a rule of universal entailment. To see LP in action, picture a knowledge base about a set of statements in a messy information system, say, a medical database that aggregates patient reports, test results, and clinician notes. In the real world, contradictions are not unusual. A patient's chart might indicate both that a medication was prescribed and that it was not prescribed. A lab report might say a value is high and not high, depending on scales or units. In a paraconsistent environment like LP, we can assign truth values to each statement in a way that keeps the contradictions from poisoning the entire knowledge base. A statement such as the patient shows improvement might be true, while the patient shows no improvement might also be true. In a robust LP-like system, we would say that these sentences are both true and false with respect to different aspects of the data, or that there is truth-preserving information from one side and truth-rejecting information from the other, without deriving that every conclusion is admissible. The practical upshot is not that contradictions vanish, but that inference can be carefully controlled so that clinicians, researchers, and systems can still draw reliable conclusions where the data permit it, and at least avoid a collapse into nonsense where it does not. In LP, the liar's sentence L is simply a case study, one place where the logic's semantics, despite tolerating a sentence that is both true and false, prevents the derivation of any arbitrary conclusion from that contradiction alone. The consequence relation in LP is defined so that a contradiction does not automatically entail every possible proposition. You won't get from L and not sign L that the sun will rise tomorrow follows, at least not in the broad, indiscriminate sense it would in classical logic. This is what is sometimes called a form of non-explosive paraconsistency. The practical intuition is that certain inconsistent sets can be reasoned about without surrendering control of what follows from them. A chain of inferences can be developed that respects the partial availability of truth. We may know and believe some things when others are in doubt, and we can even entertain a sentence that is both true and false without letting that lead to an explosion of every claim. But LP is not the only way to approach the liar. There is a second, closely related, but often more controversial strand known as dialetheism. Dialetheists are willing to claim that some contradictions are true. They do not just tolerate the presence of both truth and falsehood in a sentence. They insist that the liar, for example, is true and false at once, and that this is not a breakdown of reason but a genuine feature of reality, or at least of our best formal models of truth. The central move is to revise the very semantics of truth so that there exist truth values that admit a glut, a state of being both true and false, and then to show how rational inference can proceed even in the presence of such glutty states. To illustrate dialetheism in action, imagine the same L as before, but now within a dialectic system that grants L both truth and falsity, and then works out the consequences of that move. The sentence L is true and false, so its assertion that it is false becomes part of the same state. The logic must specify how others relate to L, especially how implication and conjunction behave when a premise or conclusion might be both true and false. In a dialectic framework, the aim is not to sweep contradictions under the rug, but to acknowledge them and to calibrate the rules so that the presence of L's glut does not collapse the system into trivialism. The key is to define a coherent consequence relation in which contradictions have a determinate, but not universal, reach. For instance, from a dialectic premise that is both true and false, some, but not all, inferences may survive. The endgame is to retain a form of rational discourse that can still support non-trivial debates, scientific reasoning, and meaningful communication in the presence of contradictory inputs. In exploring these examples, we should pause to acknowledge the different modalities at play. LP keeps a careful boundary around what inferences are allowed when contradictions appear, while a dialectic system takes a more expansive stance on truth-value assignments, describing certain contradictory sentences as genuinely true in addition to being false. Both respond to the same puzzle, the liar paradox, by saying, the world of truth is more nuanced than a binary yes or no picture. They also share a broader admiration for logics that can accommodate complexity without surrendering the possibility of knowledge, justification, or argumentation. These discussions don't happen in a vacuum. They sit inside a web of semantic theories about truth that include Tarski's classic ideas about truth and reference and the way truth predicates behave in formal languages. Tarski argued in essence that truth must be a property of sentences in a formal language through a correspondence with facts in the world. A famous way to phrase his insight is that a sentence is true if and only if it corresponds to the facts. The key, however, is that such truth can only be defined within a hierarchical or stratified framework. You cannot consistently assign truth to the language that contains the truth predicate itself without risking semantic chaos. The classic tension is clear. To speak about truth, we must segment languages or accept a careful theory of truth that avoids self-reference in ways that guarantee consistency. This is where Kripke's theory of partial truth enters, as a bridge between Tarski's clean, hierarchical picture and the messy, self-referential paradoxes we actually encounter. Kripke proposed that the truth predicate can be partially defined. Some sentences are true, some false, some neither, and some perhaps both, depending on how fixed points of truth are reached in a given language. The beauty of Kripkean semantics, for our purposes, is that it shows one can model a notion of truth that respects a form of paraconsistency without pillaring the entire structure into explosion. The liar in a Kripkean world might fall into the gaps or into a state of partial truth, and the way we reason about such sentences depends on the stage we're allowed to reference as we grow a stable, well-founded understanding of truth. In fact, the literature highlights a fruitful cross-reference of paraconsistent logics with truth theories, and this is where Eubulides' no-self-reference paradox becomes especially helpful. Eubulides offered a paradox that strips away the conventional self-reference that crystallizes in the standard liar. He constructed an infinite sequence of sentences, each saying about the next sentence in the chain that it is false. The remarkable thing about Eubulides' paradox is that no sentence directly refers to itself, yet the entire chain yields a paradoxical structure that looks surprisingly similar to the classical liar's paradox. The comparison matters for two reasons. First, it shows that paradoxes do not require a self-referential loop to destabilize a theory of truth. Non-self-referential paradoxes can generate similar tensions. Second, it provides a way to test paraconsistent and dialectic logics against a broader class of problems, asking whether the same tools that manage self-reference can be extended or adapted to handle chains of no-self-reference paradoxes. Eubulides' construction invites us to cross-reference to Tarski-Kripke frameworks in a stimulating way. In one sense, Eubulides' sentences can be read as lacking a truth attribution in the immediate sense. Yet through their interlocking dependencies, they create a global inconsistency when we attempt to assign standard truth values to the entire infinite sequence. This mirrors the concerns in Tarski-Kripke semantics about fixed points and the risk that a naive, totalizing truth predicate will misbehave. If we adopt Kripke's partial truth strategy, a Eubulides-like sequence might be assigned a staged truth pattern. Some portions of the sequence could be declared true, some false, and some remain undecided until a stable fixed point is achieved. The point is not merely technical. It underscores how self-reference and no-self-reference paradoxes stress different but related aspects of truth, and how paraconsistent and dialectic logics offer a common toolkit for navigating their consequences without lapsing into explosion. There are not just philosophical and technical threads here, there are vivid historical ones as well. The rise of paraconsistent logic in the latter half of the 20th century is not a sterile matter of axioms and tables. It is a response to long-standing concerns about paradoxes in mathematics and language, and to the practical conflicts that arise in real-world reasoning. In mathematics, paradoxes have sometimes seemed to threaten the entire edifice. Cantor's set-theoretic paradoxes, the liar-like statements about truth, and foundational challenges raised the alarm that our systems might be built on shaky ground. In language and philosophy of language, paradoxes reveal the fragility of ordinary semantics when we treat truth as a simple, global predicate. Paraconsistent logicians argued that it's possible to acknowledge the reality of inconsistent data without making reason itself unsalvageable. In the Brazilian and broader Latin American logical communities, this project took on a formative shape, combining mathematical rigor with a philosophical appetite for revisiting cherished assumptions about truth, inference, and obligation. Two historical anecdotes can illuminate this path. The first concerns Newton da Costa, a central figure in the early development of paraconsistent logic. His work, beginning in the 1960s, was not merely an academic exercise in tweaking a few logical rules. It was a bold challenge to the long-standing conviction that inconsistency must be annihilated at all costs. Da Costa's programs created formal systems in which contradictions could exist side by side with coherent inferential structures. His formulations offered a precise, technical rebuttal to the idea that any inconsistency inevitably collapses the entire body of knowledge. In the years that followed, DaCosta's proposals became a touchstone for debates across the globe. They inspired a generation of logicians to ask, with newfound audacity, how much contradiction a theory could tolerate before it lost its explanatory power. The anecdote here is not merely about a technical breakthrough. It's about a shift in mood, the sense that logic could, and perhaps should, be more flexible than the binary demands of classical truth would permit. The second anecdote returns us to the English-speaking analytic milieu with Graham Priest, whose exploration of paraconsistent logics, especially the logic of paradox, LP, and the broader dialectic program helped to crystallize a new frontier in the philosophy of logic. The debates around dialetheism in contemporary philosophy of logic have been lively precisely because they push questions that go beyond the formalities of truth tables and semantics. When Priest champions sentences that are both true and false, he invites robust reply from proponents of the traditional view, those who think that truth must be a clean, one-valued matter. The discussions extend into areas as diverse as the philosophy of mathematics, the theory of knowledge, and even normative ethics, where the acceptance of conflicting information forces a re-examination of how we justify beliefs or how we reason about obligations when information is ambiguous. The rhetorical energy around dialetheism, its confrontations with law-like reasoning, with mathematics, with science, points to a broader, ongoing conversation about whether there can be rational integrity in the presence of genuine contradictions. The quote I mentioned earlier, that a sentence can be both true and false, is not just a slogan. It functions as an invitation to rethink the boundaries of truth and to consider how rational agents should navigate a landscape in which the world does not yield to binary verdicts so easily. If we think about real-world applications beyond the academic blackboard, paraconsistent and dialectic logics offer practical tools for dealing with inconsistencies that inevitably arise in information systems. In the age of big data, knowledge graphs, and distributed information, contradictions are not rare, they are the norm in many domains. Consider a hospital's electronic health records, where conflicting test results or contradictory clinician notes may exist side by side. A paraconsistent approach allows a system to handle such inconsistencies gracefully, preserving the value of each piece of information without forcing an all-or-nothing conclusion that could jeopardize patient safety. Similarly, in scientific data integration, researchers from different teams may report results that do not align, at least at first glance. A paraconsistent framework could encode the different lines of evidence, track their sources, and support cautious inference about which conclusions are robust given the presence of conflicting data. The aim is not to force consensus where none exists, but to enable responsible, evidence-based reasoning in the presence of real-world inconsistency. Dialetheism has its own kinds of ethical and epistemic implications, and these have been vigorously debated. If there are sentences that are both true and false, does that threaten our ordinary trust in truth as a guide to action? Does it undermine the basis of knowledge, or can it offer a richer, more nuanced picture of justification that accounts for conflicting evidence? Critics have pressed two main lines of objection. First, there is the worry that embracing true contradictions could lead to trivialism, that is, that everything becomes derivable and thus no claim, no belief, no policy remains trusted. In response, proponents of paraconsistent logics emphasize the role of carefully defined inference rules that prevent such a slide into trivialism. They show that when you design the logic to restrict how inconsistencies propagate, you can preserve a form of rational discrimination even in the face of contradictions. The outcome is a system where some conclusions remain secure and useful, while others are flagged as suspect or provisional, depending on how they relate to the inconsistent information. Second, there is a normative and epistemic challenge. If we accept that some contradictions are true, what becomes of moral duties, epistemic justification, and the confidence we place in our beliefs? If you are committed to a clean world of truth and falsity, how do you handle cases where a core proposition and its negation both hold? The dialectic camp has offered responses to this challenge, arguing that it is possible to maintain careful norms of belief and action even when some contradictions are admitted into the theoretical framework. They emphasize distinctions between different kinds of truth and different kinds of justification. Some truths may be robust enough to guide action despite surrounding contradictions. Others may be strictly contingent on particular interpretations or evidence. The moral and epistemic implications are not peripheral. They are central to understanding whether and how dialectic theories can be integrated into our broader worldview without dissolving the grounds for reasoned life in a world that is messy and complex. As we move through these arguments, it's helpful to cross-reference to broader logical theories that illuminate how paraconsistent ideas relate to truth more generally. The Tarski-Kripke family of frameworks gives us a language in which to discuss truth predicates without collapsing into runaway self-reference. Tarski's insight about truth as correspondence reminds us that truth is not a free-floating property that can be assigned arbitrarily. It is anchored, at least in classical discussions, to a notion of facts. Kripke's partial truth semantics extend this by allowing a truth predicate to be only partially defined in a way that accommodates sentences whose truth status is unresolved by the system. The marriage of Tarski's ideas with Kripke's flexibility creates a scaffold within which both LP and dialetheism can be explored meaningfully. In LP, for instance, the truth values can be interpreted as guided by a three-valued semantics that respects non-explosive consequence, while in dialetheism, truth can be understood as a more robust state in which a sentence can stand in for both its truth and its negation. The two approaches share a common aspiration, to preserve meaningful inference and meaningful discourse even when the data do not neatly settle into true or false. To sharpen the comparison further, we can bring Yablow's no-self-reference paradox back into view as a diagnostic tool. Yablow's sequence avoids self-reference, yet it still forces us to confront how truth can be stable or unstable in the presence of a chain of claims about others. The no-self-reference nature of Yablow's paradox isolates a structural form, a network of statements where each one projects a claim about the future state of the other statements, and the whole network's coherence comes under pressure if one tries to assign conventional truth values across the board. In a sense, Yablow tests whether non-self-referential paradoxes can be resolved by the same structural tools that paraconsistent and dialectic logics deploy for self-referential paradoxes. A Kripkean partial truth interpretation can sometimes absorb Yablow's pattern by allowing segments of the chain to be undecided, or by permitting a sentence to be true in one stage and false in another, without committing to a globally explosion-prone stance. In LP, we can also model Yablow-like configurations by allowing multiple truth statuses and by characterizing how conjunction, disjunction, and implication behave under uneven truth assignments. The practical payoff is the same logical tools that tame the liar can also tame the non-self-referential paradoxes, opening a coherent space for reasoning about a broad spectrum of inconsistencies. The modern interpretations of paraconsistent logic and dialetheism have extended beyond pure theory into many disciplines. In computer science and artificial intelligence, these logics have become practical tools for managing inconsistent information in knowledge bases, databases, and multi-agent systems. In philosophy, they have energized debates about the nature of truth, belief, and justification in ways that intersect with ethics, epistemology, and metaphysics. In mathematics, they encourage a reevaluation of the boundaries between proof and evidence, urging us to distinguish between what follows from a set of premises under consistent conditions and what remains stable when contradictions are present in the background. In linguistics and the philosophy of language, the liar paradox remains a touchstone for discussing how content and truth attributions get entangled with the structure of language, how indexical or self-referential phenomena complicate semantic theories, and how to classify paradoxes that are self-referential versus those that are not. Let me now pivot to a more explicit survey of the practical benefits and challenges of this approach. A central strength of paraconsistent logics is their ability to prevent trivialization. Suppose you are building a reasoning system for a medical diagnostic workflow. If the system were to explode under a contradiction, if every contradiction implied every possible consequence, the system would lose the capacity to distinguish between plausible inferences and purely arbitrary ones. Paraconsistent logics preserve a nuanced space in which certain conclusions remain credible because their inference paths avoid explosive contagion. This is not a license to ignore contradictions, but a disciplined method for containing them. In a domain like legal reasoning, where conflicting evidence and competing interpretations are par for the course, paraconsistent approaches offer a way to reason with two competing narratives without being forced into a binary simplification that erases either side's legitimate claims. In both settings, the methodology emphasizes traceability, provenance, and constrained entailment, features that can be made transparent to human users, enabling robust decision-making rather than a blind collapse into inconsistency. Yet the challenges are real. A key counterargument which has been persistent in the literature is that paraconsistent logics might open the door to trivialism if not carefully regulated. If a system does not prevent the straightforward propagation of contradictions into conclusions, one might fear that every proposition becomes acceptable, and knowledge becomes unrecoverable from the noise. The response from paraconsistent logicians has been to emphasize refined semantics and restricted consequence relations. The aim is to maintain a delicate balance. Contradictions are tolerated, but they do not authorize the wholesale acceptance of any proposition. In other words, explosion is rejected, but not every form of inference is automatically legitimate. There are normative rules built into the logic about which inferences survive in the presence of inconsistent information. The second major counterargument concerns normative and epistemic implications. If a dialetheist insists that some contradictions are true, what does that mean for justification, proof, and our commitments to truth-guided action? How should we revise our concepts of justification, belief, and knowledge when faced with true contradictions? These are not merely abstract questions. They touch the everyday life of science, law, and moral reasoning. The traditional view of truth as a guide to action hinges on a fairly stable division of sentences into true and false, with reliable inference built upon that division. Dialetheists reply that we can preserve normative structure by distinguishing different kinds of truth and different modalities of justification, admitting that some contradictory sentences are true without dissolving the normative boundaries that govern trustworthy reasoning in ordinary cases. They argue that in some contexts, the truth of a contradiction may be a more faithful description of certain states of affairs, say, in self-referential systems or in contexts loaded with competing evidence, than any attempt to force a tidy, classical verdict. The debate, in this sense, is not merely technical, but deeply connected to how we conceive epistemic responsibility and practical rationality in a world of imperfect information. As we've threaded through these points, it's fitting to draw a few concrete cross-references to the intellectual landscape that has shaped these discussions. On the one hand, the Tarski-Kripke framework sits at the center of discussions about truth predicates, semantic assent, and the limits of a single, global truth notion. Tarski's insistence on truth as correspondence to facts, and the realization that a truth predicate may require stratification for consistency, is a touchstone here. On the other hand, Kripke's approach to truth, his idea of partial truth, fixed points, and the allowance for sentences to be neither true nor false at certain stages, offers a concrete semantic mechanism to handle paradoxical sentences in a way that resonates with paraconsistent thinking. The dialogue between these frameworks helps us see how LP and dialetheism can be appropriately situated within a broader, philosophically coherent account of truth, one that neither sweeps contradictions under the rug nor collapses into universal skepticism. The variety of approaches we've explored, LP's controlled tolerance of contradictions, dialetheism's assertion that some contradictions are genuinely true, plus the semantic scaffolding provided by Tarski and Kripke, and the comparative lens of Eubulides' no-self-reference paradox, presents a rich tapestry for contemporary reflection. This tapestry invites cross-referencing to other thinkers and ideas for deeper depth. For instance, the broad tradition of non-classical logics includes not only paraconsistent logics like LP and its kin, but also intuitionistic logics, relevance logics, and many valued logics with different philosophical commitments. The cross-pollination with mathematics, computer science, and linguistics is live and ongoing. In the philosophy of mathematics, the paraconsistent approach interacts with the way mathematicians think about foundational issues and about the role of paradox in theory building. In computer science, paraconsistent logics inform the design of databases, knowledge bases, and reasoning systems that must cope with inconsistent information without grinding to a halt. To ground this discussion in primary voices, consider a few lines that crystallize the stakes. Graham Priest has written extensively on the paradoxes of truth and the acceptability of contradictions within a logical framework. He has been explicit that a sentence can be both true and false, and that such a claim, though radical, is not a philosophical scandal once we understand the logic's semantics. Newton da Costa, for his part, insisted that we can have a logical system that tolerates inconsistency without collapse, thereby challenging the long-standing conviction that inconsistency must be banished at all costs. The very phrasing of this project, Paraconsistent Logics Reject Explosion, is not just a technical manifesto. It is a philosophical stance about how we ought to reason about information in a world that is messy, complex, and often not neatly partitioned into true and false. In the background, the truth-conditional picture remains a central reference point. The Tarski quote, "A sentence is true if and only if it corresponds to the facts," gives a crisp, aspirational target for truth. Yet the counterpoint from Kripke's semantics, truth predicates that can be partial, staged, or context-dependent, reminds us that even our best theories of truth may need to accommodate a more dynamic or layered reality. The paradialectic with Eubulides' paradox further sharpens the contrast. It shows us that we do not necessarily need a sentence to refer to itself directly in order to generate paradoxical pressures. The structural analysis, whether through paraconsistent logics, dialectic semantics, or fixed-point theories, provides a flexible toolkit for engaging with these phenomena in a disciplined way. Two more anchors for the imagination might be helpful as you listen. First, recall the laboratory metaphor. Think of a laboratory where contradictions are not erased but are isolated in a controlled environment. The lab has sprays and shields, rules about which inferences are allowed, which outcomes are permissible, and what counts as evidence. Contradictions exist there, but they do not automatically contaminate every experiment. Second, consider a legal brief in which competing experts present opposing findings. The brief does not vanish into a single truth. Rather, the court must weigh the evidence, recognize the conflict, and decide on a rational basis. Paraconsistent logics and dialetheism offer conceptual and formal tools that model these real-world situations. They permit us to capture the texture of reasoning in the presence of inconsistency rather than forcing a premature closure. In closing this segment, I want to keep one thread distinct and yet connected. The aim here has not been to prove that every contradiction is true or to celebrate a world morally saturated with inconsistency. Rather, the project is to explore a more resilient way of thinking about truth and inference, one that can accommodate the messy, often non-ideal data that characterize science, law, medicine, and everyday knowledge. Paraconsistent logics show us that contradictory information does not have to be a fatal blow to rational inquiry. Dialetheism, for its part, pushes us to confront a radical possibility: that some contradictions might be true in a robust sense, and that our conceptual tools must be ready to handle that possibility with care rather than denial. The cross-references to Tarski, Kripke, and Eubulides deepen the conversation by offering structural pointers about how truth is built, how paradoxes can be represented in layered semantics, and how non-self-referential forms of paradox might align with or diverge from the classic liar. If you're listening closely, you might notice a practical motif threading through all of this: the importance of control. The control is not over data per se, but over the way we reason about it in the face of conflict. The aim is to preserve meaningful inquiry, not to pretend that inconsistencies do not exist, and certainly not to pretend that all statements carry equal weight. The tools of paraconsistent logic and dialetheism offer a disciplined vocabulary for describing, classifying, and crucially, using inconsistencies in ways that broadens our capacity to think clearly in a world that often refuses to be tidy. This is not a final verdict on truth, nor a last word on the liar. It is a map of possibilities, a reminder that the history of logic has always included brave experiments that asked whether we can keep reasoning alive even when contradictions visit us at the door. The journey from Da Costa's early paraconsistent logics through Priest's logic of paradox to contemporary debates about dialetheism centers not on denying paradoxes, but on rethinking what it means to reason about them. The cross-pollination with the Tarski-Kripke framework and with Eubulides' no-self-reference paradox shows that the field continues to evolve by testing core intuitions in new settings. The result is a richer, more nuanced picture of truth, one that welcomes careful attention to contradictions without surrendering to either blind skepticism or reckless inference. If you'd like, we can now turn to a few more case studies, or perhaps go deeper into a step-by-step demonstration of a simple LP-style proof or a dialectic derivation, to give you a concrete feel for how these logics operate in practice. We can also compare specific passages from primary sources to illustrate how the authors themselves articulate the core moves, and we can trace how those moves have opened up new questions in philosophy of logic, mathematics, and cognitive science. For now, I hope this overview has offered you a sense of why paraconsistent logic and dialetheism are not mere curiosities, but meaningful, enduring responses to the paradoxes that have haunted philosophy since the days of Aristotle and beyond. The liar paradox begins as a whisper in a language game and ends up rippling through entire theories of truth, meaning, and the limits of reason. It asks not what is true in ordinary life, but what would have to be true if a single sentence could claim and deny itself at once. In Snooze philosophy's cadence, we let this paradox unfold slowly, like a patient unraveling of a thread that seems to tie itself into a knot, only to reveal a broader loom behind it. The question is not merely about contradictions. It is about the very scaffolding we use to talk about reality, to assign truth values, and to navigate language without wandering into self-canceling nets. The paradox has a way of insisting that we pause and look at the conditions under which we assert anything at all. It asks us to consider what truth means when the truth-maker speaks from within the sentence that makes the claim. Origins are not a single act, but a constellation of issues that cluster around language, reference, and the epistemic claims we make when we say something about the world. The oldest seeds are often thought to be found in the Greek tradition, where philosophy began to study the rules of talk themselves, rather than only the things talked about. In the murky margins of ancient texts, Epimenides the Cretan is said to have proclaimed that all Cretans are liars. We hear the paradox echoed in later reports, and though the exact wording survives only in fragments and later compilations, the intuition is clear. If a Cretan says that all Cretans lie and that statement is true, then a liar exists who speaks truly, which would be a contradiction. If that statement is false, then not all Cretans lie, which still leaves the door open to a host of tricky implications. It is the simplest form of self-reference that lands us into a circle. A statement stands in a position to refute its own adequacy as a ground for truth. In a sense, Epimenides' claim is the seed of the liar paradox, a seed that later thinkers would prune into more precise philosophical questions. The most explicit articulation of the paradox in antiquity is attributed to Eubulides of Miletus, a figure we meet in later discussions as the logician who set up versions of the liar scenario for examination. It is frequently said that he proposed sentences that are true and false at the same time, or sentences that deny their own truth. The historical record, however, is sketchy about their exact formulations, and the surviving remarks about Eubulides arrive to us through later commentators who reconstruct a problem rather than reproduce a verbatim text. What remains vivid is the sense that self-reference, when it comes to statements about truth, outstrips ordinary logic. It is an edge case that tests whether truth is a simple binary across all sentences, or whether there are sentences for which truth cannot be allocated in the usual way without reducing the system to a contradiction. Aristotle gives us one of the most enduring roots of the problem in a more general form, the law of non-contradiction. He states, in effect, that the same thing cannot at the same time belong and not belong to the same thing in the same respect. This is not merely a sentence about the physical world. It is a formal constraint about how we talk about propositions. It is the bedrock principle many logicians take as a starter, the assumption under which the liar paradox looks like a bug in a program rather than a feature of language itself. Yet even Aristotle's bold claim reveals the fragility of any attempt to create a language in which every sentence has a definite place in truth-value assignment. The paradox is not only about negation. It is also about the meta-level, about how a sentence about truth is allowed to say something about itself in relation to the system of truth in which it resides. To sharpen the sense of the ancient impulse, we should imagine a sentence that says, "This sentence is false. If it is true, then it is false," which seems to undermine its truth. If it is false, then it is true, which seems to sustain its truth, but now under a different interpretation. The sentence drags us into a cascade. The very act of asserting truth brings with it the possibility of negation, while negation beckons for a new assertion of truth. The paradox thus becomes a test case for any robust theory of truth that wants to keep reasoning intact in the presence of self-reference. In a broader sense, this test case is a probe for how far a language can stretch before it collapses into inconsistent ground or winds up with a consistent but vacuous truth predicate. The arc from antiquity to modern logic is not a straight line but a stair-step climb, with successive thinkers offering sharper tools for analyzing self-reference. The first major turn is not to deny the paradox, but to describe the structure of truth in a way that can accommodate, or at least delimit, self-reference. Frege's program, for instance, sought a precise notion of truth as a property of sentences that could be defined in a purely object language in terms of its reference and its compositional structure. But the liar sentence challenges even Frege's clean notions, because it seems to anchor truth not in a straightforward picture of the world, but in a sentence that claims such truth about itself, without reference to any straightforward fact in the world. The result is not a mere error label. It is a project to look at truth in a systematic way that can handle, or outrun, paradoxes by introducing levels, hierarchies, or alternative semantic prescriptions. Two intertwined responses shape how the modern era treats the liar paradox. One is to escalate to a hierarchy of languages, a move rooted in the work of Tarski. The other is to allow truth to be a more robust and layered concept, as Kripke learns to articulate when dealing with truth predicates that fail to form a complete, well-defined extension in the language we use. Tarski's approach is deceptively simple. If a sentence in a language L talks about truth in L, then you need a metalanguage to talk about truth in L. The liar sentence S within L cannot be assigned a truth value without stepping outside L to a language where such a claim can be evaluated. If we stay inside L, S forces a collapse. If we step outside, we can report that S is not true in L, or that it is undecidable within L. The hierarchy thus becomes a metatheoretical tool to avoid the self-reflective trap. It is not a ban on self-reference per se, but a disciplined separation of levels to prevent the formation of a single sentence from both asserting and negating itself within the same system. A different compass point appears with Kripke's fixed-point theory of truth. Kripke asks, can we assign truth values in a language that contains its own truth predicate by constructing a partial theory of truth that grows, stage by stage, from a conservative starting point? The answer under Kripke's analysis is subtle and empowering. Begin with a base language that has no truth predicate, then add a partial truth predicate and interpret sentences in a way that reveals several layers of truth or falsehood. Some sentences turn out to be true, some false, and some are neither true nor false, gaps in the extension that reflect a robustly non-classical view of truth. In such a framework, the liar sentence can be neither true nor false, and the paradox ceases to force the entire system into contradiction, because the semantics is not forced to decide every sentence strictly as true or false. Paradoxes thereby invite a more nuanced semantics in which truth is not a single binary, but a spectrum shaped by a hierarchy or by a fixed-point construction. Beyond Tarski and Kripke lies the practical matter of how we use truth in science, mathematics, linguistics, and cognitive science. The liar paradox is not merely a quaint puzzle to argue about the nature of truth. It is a live warning sign about the limits of formalization, a reminder that our best philosophical and mathematical tools have to cope with self-reference. In mathematics and logic, Gödel's incompleteness theorem is the most celebrated metamuzzle on what a formal system can decide. Gödel showed in a precise and striking way that any sufficiently powerful, consistent formal system cannot prove all truths about arithmetic inside itself. There will always be true propositions that remain unprovable within the system. This is a technical statement, but the intuition is not far from the liar. If a sentence can express a form of self-reference that escapes internal verification, the system becomes vulnerable to a kind of self-characterization that it cannot fully vindicate from within its own walls. Gödel's sentence is a way of giving a concrete form to the system's own inability to prove everything that its own archangel of truth can express. Another parallel arises in computer science with the halting problem. The idea is that there is no general algorithm that can determine, for every possible program and input, whether the program halts or runs forever. The halting problem shares a kinship with the liar paradox in that both are meta-level problems about the capabilities and limits of formal systems to decide something about themselves. If you try to construct a universal decider for all statements, including self-referential ones, you are back to the same place. You need a higher-order mechanism to evaluate the self-applying scenarios. In a telling way, the liar paradox, Gödel's incompleteness, and the halting problem are meta-muzzles. They shut down the dream of a single, all-knowing system that can decide truth values for every sentence that can be formulated with its own language. The practical implications of these theoretical reflections pour into real-world disciplines. In mathematics, the existence of undecidable propositions in a given formal system matters for the confidence of proofs and the search for new axioms. If a mathematician can show that a system is incomplete, one response is to extend the system with new axioms or to adopt a different foundational stance, such as a constructive or a predicative approach. In computer science, the implications are broad and concrete. Software and hardware designers must acknowledge that self-reference can produce undecidable or non-terminating behaviors. When you embed a truth predicate into a programming language or create an interpreter that can reason about its own code, the risk of paradox-like behavior is non-trivial. In practice, computer scientists often circumvent such issues through type systems, separate metalanguages, compilation stages, or fixed-point combinators that can be used to reason about self-application without collapsing the entire computation. Natural language processing, NLP, and artificial intelligence, AI, inherit these concerns as well. If a system is tasked with reasoning about language that includes truth predicates or self-referential phrases, the system must be prepared to encounter self-referential statements that cannot be settled by ordinary truth conditions. This is one reason why modern approaches to truth in AI frequently rely on multi-layered representations, probabilistic reasoning, and ordinal or paraconsistent logics that can tolerate inconsistent information without exploding into complete failure. The practical takeaway is that, when building AI systems that engage with human language, designers must be mindful of the structural limits of truth as a binary predicate. They must provide a way to handle self-reference by either restricting recursion in the language the system can inspect, or by equipping the system with a more nuanced notion of truth that can admit gaps, as Kripke's approach suggests, or even manage inconsistencies with controlled tolerances as pursued in paraconsistent logic. In law and policy, the presence of self-reference in regulatory text is not hypothetical but a recurring challenge. Statutes sometimes include self-applicatory or self-referential provisions designed to regulate the regulator or the regulatory process itself. The risk is not merely theoretical. Such self-reference can generate interpretive ambiguity, administrative gridlock, or enforcement contradictions if the text tries to talk about itself in a way that outruns the standard interpretive tools. Consider, for instance, a regulatory clause that states, "This regulation shall apply to all individuals and entities, including the administering agency, and shall be interpreted in light of this regulation." The self-applicatory language can prompt questions about whether the regulation governs the regulator, whether it can be interpreted by reference to itself, or whether modifications to the regulation require a higher-order amendment. In practice, regulatory texts attempt to avoid these difficulties by carefully delimiting the scope of the regulation, setting out the hierarchy of laws, and by adopting interpretive rules that anchor self-reference in a transparent way. Yet the very fact that such clauses exist, or sometimes arise in policy design, demonstrates the real-world pressure of self-reference and the importance of logical hygiene in law and governance. To understand these implications more vividly, and to anchor the discussion in real-world immediacy, we can turn to concrete industry-relevant examples that illustrate the way self-reference works in practice and why it matters beyond the philosophical salon. The first example comes from computer science and programming languages. Self-reference in programming languages or compilers, especially through the phenomenon of quins and self-hosting systems. A quine is a program that outputs its own source code. The existence of quins demonstrates, in a clean and tangible way, how a language can represent itself within itself. A simple Python quine might involve a string that contains the program's own source code in a way that, when printed, reproduces the exact same sequence of characters. The logic here is not merely a trick. It is a precise demonstration of fixed points in the evaluation of a language's semantics. A quine requires the interpreter and the code to share a common meta-understanding. The program must be able to produce a representation of itself as output. From a broader perspective, quins reveal how self-reference can be harnessed to test the expressive power of a language, to stress-test compilers, and to illuminate the careful balance between syntax and semantics. They show that languages can be designed to perform self-inspection and yet avoid trivial or paradoxical results, provided the semantics of quoting, evaluation, and printing are modeled with care. In real-world compiler design, self-hosting compilers written in the language they compile, are a landmark achievement that illustrates the practical reach of self-reference. The act of building a compiler in the very language you want the compiler to translate embodies a meta-level loop. The system is both the instrument and the subject of its own instrumentality. This is not a mere curiosity. It signals that in programming language design, the issue of self-reference must be anticipated and managed through robust type systems, clear separation of compile time and runtime semantics, and careful staging of evaluation passes. The halting problem sits close by as a reminder that even a well-typed, well-structured language can resist a single algorithmic solution to all questions of program behavior. The paradox becomes a guiding intuition for the limits of formal decidability in software analysis and verification, especially as automation grows in complexity and autonomy. The second industry-relevant example lies in the legal or regulatory realm, where self-referential statements in regulatory text surface in interesting and sometimes problematic forms. Consider a hypothetical but plausible clause in a regulatory document. This regulation shall apply to this regulation, and to every act or regulation that references this regulation. Such a clause could aim to ensure that amendments to the regulation are always subject to the overarching framework of the regulation itself. The problem, however, is that this creates a paradoxical loop. If the regulation claims to apply to itself in all aspects, including its own amendment, what happens when a change to the regulation alters the clause that says it applies to itself? Does the amendment retroactively apply to the new clause, or does it apply only to pre-amendment text? Does the clause's self-application extend to the regulator's own decision-making processes about the regulation? Does it create a self-referential standard that is impossible to satisfy without a higher-order decision rule? In practice, regulatory authors try to avoid that kind of self-referentiality by designing interpretive priorities and by delegating amendments to an overarching legislative framework rather than embedding meta-clauses within the regulatory text itself. Yet the potential for self-reference remains a source of complexity whenever language is used to govern itself as much as it governs others. These two examples, the Quine in programming and the self-referential clause in policy, illustrate how the liar paradox extends beyond abstract logic and enters the everyday work of designing systems and rules that are supposed to be clear, stable, and enforceable. The point is not to instill fear about paradoxes, but to show how truth concepts, language, and formal structures are intimately connected to the kinds of problems we face in technology, law, and governance. If we want to build reliable AI, design robust software, draft fair regulations, and reason about mathematics with confidence, we must cultivate tools that can negotiate self-reference without collapsing into inconsistency. That means we need robust theories of truth that accommodate self-reference, that recognize the possibility of gaps or partial truth values, and that allow for the disciplined use of metalanguage to avoid paradoxes from spiraling out of control. To deepen the discussion, let us cross-reference to related paradoxes that share a family resemblance with the liar. The Berry paradox, for instance, arises when we try to construct a phrase that designates the smallest positive integer not definable in under 11 words, and end up with a contradiction about the length of the phrase used to define the number itself. The essence of the Berry paradox is a self-reference of a different ilk, not a sentence about its own truth value, but a sentence about the definability of a number in a given linguistic economy. Yet both paradoxes reveal the vulnerability of self-reference to linguistic quirks, the way that language, rules of description, and the boundaries of definability can clash when we push them to the edge. The Grelling-Nelson paradox is another cousin in the family. It concerns autological versus heterological words. A word is autological if it describes itself, for example, short is short, polysyllabic is polysyllabic, and heterological if it does not describe itself. The paradox arises when we ask whether the word heterological is itself heterological. If it is, then by being heterological it does not describe itself, which would imply it is not heterological after all. If it is not heterological, then it does describe itself, which would render it heterological. This paradox is not about truth value in a direct sense, but about self-reference in a different domain, the semantics of linguistic properties themselves. It highlights how truth-like predicates and self-description can generate their own difficulties when we push language to describe language. In analytic philosophy more broadly, the liar speaks to ongoing debates about truth, reference, and meaning. There are competing theories of truth, deflationary theories, which treat truth as a mere logical device for expressing propositions without adding substantive content. Correspondence theories, which tie truth to the way the world actually is, and coherentist or pragmatist approaches, which locate truth in the coherence of a system of beliefs or their usefulness in practice. The liar test pushes against each of these theories in different ways. A deflationary account has to explain why some statements generate paradoxical pressure when the truth predicate is allowed to apply to sentences about themselves. A straightforward correspondence theory has to account for how reference is fixed when a sentence refers to its own truth status rather than to observable facts. And a coherentist or pragmatic approach must concede that certain self-referential sentences challenge the internal coherence of the entire system if they are allowed to become self-justifying. The modern responses to the liar paradox often involve more than technical repairs. They embody a broader shift in how we think about truth in language. Some philosophers embrace a robust, layered theory of truth in which sentences can be true in virtue of their satisfaction in a given semantic layer, while other sentences remain truth valueless because their conditions of truth fail to form a fixed point in the hierarchy. Others still defend paraconsistent logics in which contradictions do not explode the entire theory of truth, allowing a controlled tolerance for both true and false sentences in a given system. These moves do not deny the paradox, they reframe it in a way that keeps reasoning moving while acknowledging structural limits. The paradox becomes not a disproof of truth, but a clue about the architecture of truth itself. In cognitive science and linguistics, the liar paradox intersects with how humans process self-referential statements and how we calibrate logic with everyday speech. The mind is adept at handling a variety of self-referential tasks, such as metacognition, introspection, and the recursive aspects of language acquisition, but not all self-reference is created equal. The paradox presses on the edge cases where the mental model of truth must coordinate with model hierarchies and interpretive rules in a way that is not entirely captured by straightforward truth-functional semantics. It invites interdisciplinary collaborations between logicians, linguists, cognitive scientists, and AI researchers to develop theories that reflect the way humans actually think about statements that talk about truth, reference, and meaning. Let me pause here to anchor a couple of historical anecdotes that illuminate this ongoing conversation. The first anecdote concerns the early 20th century, when the rise of formal logic demanded that philosophers and mathematicians take seriously the possibility that truth could outpace proof. In the wake of Gödel's incompleteness, many logicians felt as though a veil had been drawn back. The dream of a complete, consistent, fully axiomatizable theory of all mathematical truths within a single system was revealed to be a mirage at best. The anecdote is not about a dramatic discovery, but about the quiet, stubborn work of mathematicians who faced the implications of incompleteness with seriousness. They asked whether one should abandon ambitious formal programs or instead refine the frameworks so that the new limits could be explored in a way that respects the new boundaries. This turning point in logic and foundations set the stage for modern semantics, including the idea that truth is not a singular, all-encompassing predicate but a layered, context-dependent notion that requires careful architecture. A second anecdote comes from the development of model theory and Kripke's pioneering work on the semantics of truth. The image is of a logician scribbling, stepping back, and asking, if we cannot assign truth values uniformly to all sentences when truth predicates are allowed to apply to themselves, what happens if we relax the assumption and allow some sentences to be neither true nor false? The narrative is not that self-reference collapses a system. It is that we discover there are robust ways to construct languages in which truth can be assigned in partial or staged ways, avoiding the chaos of a global fixed point. The anecdote here is about methodological flexibility, the willingness to reframe the problem by changing the tools rather than declaring the problem unmanageable. Kripke's method shows that the paradox, far from being a terminal blow to theory, can be the impetus for new, richer semantic architectures that capture the complexity of language. In the philosophical conversations that followed, the paradox has been linked to questions about realism, anti-realism, and the status of truth in discourse about possibility, belief, and assertion. A modern reader can see how the liar, far from being a mere curiosity, informs debates about truth in analytic philosophy. The paradox also cross-pollinates with cognitive science and linguistics, where it informs experimental work on how humans understand self-reference, how language users navigate statements about truth in conversation, and how memory, attention, and belief interact with self-referential claims. The cross-disciplinary strands matter because the liar is not a problem inside a temple of ideal logic. It is a phenomenon that arises whenever we treat language as a tool for describing the world, revealing how language relies on a hierarchy of interpretive layers and how systems, human or machine, must navigate self-reference with care. To ground these ideas in historical sources, consider three key figures who shaped the modern conversation. Aristotle's law of non-contradiction, stated with classic precision, is often cited as a ground rule for reasoning. The same thing cannot at the same time belong and not belong to the same thing in the same respect. This sentence, drawn from his metaphysical and logical investigations, anchors many debates about truth, negation, and explanation. It marks a civilizational commitment to coherence and non-contradiction, even as the liar paradox exposes the fragility of trying to maintain such coherence in all contexts. The paradox invites us to ask, are there contexts in which the law of non-contradiction must be revised or reinterpreted? Aristotle's own defense of the law is not simply an endorsement of a single rule, but a defense of the rational necessity of consistent discourse. Epimenides' remark, often summarized as "all Cretans are liars," stands as a seed that sprouted into centuries of reflection about truth and self-reference. It is a memory of the moment when the question of truth value began to be inseparable from the semantics of language itself. The quotation, as reported in later sources, captures the core intuition. If a statement about a group is made by a member of that group who might be lying, the statement's truth value becomes a problem that cannot be settled by ordinary reflection on the facts alone. It is the seed that recruits epistemology into a circle of self-reference, a truth that cannot be settled by the ordinary standards of evidence because the evidence depends on the truth of the claim about truth itself. Gödel's formal masterpiece delivered a direct, chilling, precise observation. There exist true propositions that cannot be proven within a given formal system. He wrote, in effect, that the dream of a complete, self-sufficient proof theory is unsustainable for any system powerful enough to encode arithmetic. The famous Gödel sentence is a crafted self-reference. This sentence is not provable. If the sentence were provable, the system would prove a falsehood. If it is not provable, the sentence is true but unprovable. The move transforms the liar-inspired self-reference into a rigorous mathematical demonstration that self-reference has consequences for the foundations of mathematics, not merely a puzzle to tinker with in a philosophy classroom. Gödel's contribution is not an isolated jab. It is a turning point that shifted the ground on which logicians and mathematicians stand, inviting a rethinking of truth, proof, and the very possibility of a universal formal theory. From this lineage, a new generation of philosophers and logicians, including Kripke, develop frameworks that resist collapse by allowing partial truth, or by acknowledging that a truth predicate may not be truth conditional in every sentence of a language with self-reference. Kripke's approach creates a hierarchy in which truth is assigned in layers, enabling a language to talk about its own truth without succumbing to a global paradox. The result is a robust, nuanced, and sophisticated theory that responds to the paradox not by retreating into mere denial or celebration of undecidability, but by constructing a semantic architecture that can tolerate the presence of truth gaps or non-classical truth values. It is in this spirit that modern analytic discussions about truth often proceed, with respect for the paradox's force, but with a willingness to revise the underlying architecture so that reasoning can proceed with more clarity and fewer crashes. As a closing reflection on the modern interpretations and applications, we can say that the liar paradox is not a street corner signpost directing us toward a dead end. It is a gateway into deeper landscapes of truth, reference, and meaning. It invites us to consider how language carries within it the possibility of self-reference and how our theories must be flexible enough to account for this possibility. It asks whether it is more faithful to defend a single, monolithic truth predicate or to recognize that truth may be layered, partial, or context-dependent, depending on the purpose of the discourse and the structure of the language used. The paradox invites dispassionate humility. In any system, mathematical, computational, or legal, that tries to talk about itself, self-reference is not a mere annoyance but a real constraint that demands thoughtful design. To help organize how to approach expanding this topic for a longer, more immersive script, here are some guiding themes and prompts. How paradoxes shape our understanding of truth, value, reference, and meaning. The liar is not a mere curiosity. It is a testing ground for how we allocate truth, how statements about truth behave, and what we owe to the words we use to describe the world and ourselves. We can explore how different theories of truth address the liar and how these theories influence our broader understanding of language. Implications for artificial intelligence, natural language processing, and formal systems. The liar paradox is a compass that points toward the meta-levels at which systems must operate. It invites analogies to Gödel's incompleteness, how even comprehensive reasoning systems cannot capture everything within themselves, and the halting problem as a meta-muzzle on what systems can decide. We can discuss how AI handles self-referential language and what kinds of logical architectures enable robust interpretation without succumbing to self-contradiction. Practical implications for mathematics, computer science, and law. The paradox illuminates the risks of self-reference in formal statements or regulatory language. We can examine how mathematicians handle truth in proof systems, how software engineers design languages to avoid self-reference paradoxes, and how lawmakers construct statutes that minimize self-referential ambiguity while preserving the clarity and enforceability of law. Concrete industry examples. We should anchor the discussion in two tangible scenarios, one from computer science illustrating self-reference in programming languages or compilers, and one from law or policy showing self-referential statements in regulatory text. The Quine example is a perfect entry point for the CS piece, as it demonstrates self-referential code with elegance and exactitude. For law, we can discuss a hypothetical self-referential clause in a regulatory text that raises interpretive challenges, and show how such challenges can be mitigated by careful drafting practices or hierarchical interpretive rules. Counterarguments. The liar paradox does not compel universal skepticism about truth theories. There are reasons to treat it as a theoretical puzzle with limited impact on everyday discourse and practical truth. Some theorists argue that robust, layered theories of truth and semantics can manage paradox without overhauling entire frameworks. It is valuable to present these counterarguments clearly and to show how one might respond to them, showing a balanced view of the debate. Cross-references to related paradoxes and interdisciplinary work. The Berry paradox and the Grelling-Nelson paradox offer complementary angles on self-reference and definability. The intersections with cognitive science and linguistics can illuminate how humans negotiate self-reference and how this shapes the design of language, thought, and computation. Historical anecdotes and quotes from primary sources. Use the ancient lineage from Epimenides and Aristotle to Gödel and Kripke to ground the discussion in a sense of historical continuity. We should weave in short, carefully attributed quotes from primary sources that illuminate the core themes. Aristotle on non-contradiction, Epimenides on Cretan lying, Gödel on the limits of provability. These quotations anchor the narrative in a tradition that respects the continuity of these ideas across centuries. To bring all of this into sharper focus, here is a short, representative arc of the segment you might envision for a long-form script. Begin with the paradox as a gentle whisper about language and truth, inviting the listener to reflect on ordinary statements in daily life and to notice how quickly language strays from simple truth values when self-reference enters the frame. Use a calm cadence with pauses after the central question. Can a sentence that claims something about its own truth be either true or false without causing a breakdown in our theories of truth? Then move to the historical arc, tracing the seed of the paradox to Epimenides and the later articulation by Eubulides, followed by Aristotle's insistence on non-contradiction. Read a short primary source quotation of Aristotle to illustrate the gravity and precision of these early thinkers. The aim is to remind the audience that this problem is not merely a modern curiosity, but a thread that runs through the entire Western philosophical tradition. Progress to the modern era with Gödel's incompleteness theorems, underscoring that the puzzles of truth value can have consequences for our most formal systems. Cite a brief quotation of Gödel's idea that there exist true propositions that cannot be proven, and explain how this reveals limits that are not easily fixed by adding more axioms alone. Pair this with an intuitive explanation of the halting problem as a meta-level constraint on what a system can determine about its own behavior, paralleling the liar's self-reference. Then explore the various semantic responses. Hierarchical theories to separate metalanguages from object languages, Kripkean fixed points that allow truth values to emerge gradually, with some sentences kept in abeyance to reflect gaps in truth conditions. Emphasize how these responses aim not to annihilate the paradox, but to work within a more nuanced map of truth that can accommodate self-reference without collapse. Address real-world implications in technology and governance. Use the Quine as a narrative anchor. A program that prints its own source code embodies self-reference with mathematical elegance. Then show how this concept translates into practical considerations in compiler design, program verification, and metaprogramming. For the legal example, present a carefully drawn hypothetical clause that demonstrates how self-reference can complicate interpretive tasks, and then discuss strategies to avoid those complications through clear drafting and hierarchical statutory interpretation. End with a contemplative reflection on what the liar paradox teaches about truth, reference, and meaning in a world in which human language and formal systems increasingly interpenetrate. Emphasize that even as we develop more sophisticated theories of truth and logic, paradoxes remind us of the humility we owe to the complexity of language and the limits of our own frameworks. To honor the quotes from primary sources requirement with care, we can weave in the following anchors at appropriate points in the narrative, placing them where the audience can hear them as part of the spoken thread. Aristotle's lane of reasoning: the same thing cannot at the same time belong and not belong to the same thing in the same respect. This line grounds the discussion in the law of non-contradiction and signals why the liar paradox is not merely a linguistic prank, but a challenge to foundational assumptions about truth. Epimenides' maxim, as reported in later biographical accounts, "All Cretans are liars." This line is a seed, a memory from the ancient world, and a reminder that self-reference in speech traces a long lineage. Gödel's decisive intuition: there exist true propositions that cannot be proved. A direct, forthright reminder that even the most careful formal systems face limits that no amount of clever extension seems to erase. If you wish, include a brief paraphrase of Kripke's approach in your own voice. A language can have a truth predicate, but not all sentences can be settled by it. Some truths emerge only when we step back to a larger perspective. This paraphrase captures the spirit of Kripke's staged semantics, even if you do not attempt a full technical exposition in the narrative. A concluding line that echoes the broader sentiment of the tradition: truth is a legal, philosophical, and cognitive invention that must be sturdy enough to handle its own challenges, yet flexible enough to accommodate what is beyond its confident reach. In between these anchors, the script can roam with historical anecdotes, thought experiments, and vivid analogies. Consider the analogy of a conversation between a speaker and a judge. The judge wants to know the truth of a statement, but the speaker, by claiming something about truth itself, places the judge in a position where more is required, a higher level of law, a broader context, or a different interpretive framework. The paradox becomes a narrative device that compels us to step back and consider what it would take to adjudicate such a claim. It invites the listener to picture a mind that is trying to reason about reasoning, a language that is trying to understand itself, and a system that is trying to decide whether it can decide. As you expand the topic into a long-form script, you can weave in multimedia elements that complement the narrative. Visual metaphors can depict a staircase with ever higher floors, representing hierarchical truth, where each floor can discuss the floor beneath but cannot settle the lower floors by itself. A flowchart visualization could illustrate the difference between object language truth and metalanguage truth, and show how stepping into metalanguage allows questions about truth to be addressed without collapsing into contradiction. Animations of self-referential loops, like a mirror reflecting a mirror, could offer a vivid metaphor for the recursive nature of truth, while careful narration makes sure the audience can distinguish the levels and keep track of the logic. The educational payoff of such a long-form treatment is not only a deeper understanding of the liar paradox itself, but a broader capacity to appreciate how philosophers and scientists navigate the tricky edges of language and logic. The paradox serves as a guide to thinking about what we mean when we say something about truth, about reference, and about meaning. It challenges us to examine how robust our systems must be to handle self-reference, and how we can design theories that allow for nuance, truth that can reside in layers, truth that can be context-dependent, and truth that must sometimes yield to a more complex vocabulary than binary yes or no. It invites a cognitive humility, not to surrender to paradox, but to recognize that some questions press against the edges of human language and formal reasoning, and that those edges can be productive rather than merely problematic. If you want to push even deeper in future sections, you could add case studies from current AI research, where researchers explicitly address self-reference issues in knowledge representation or in autoregressive models, drawing out how the hierarchical approach and fixed-point semantics play out in practical algorithmic design. You could also bring in conversations with linguists about self-reference in natural language, showing how speakers manage self-referential constructs with a mix of pragmatic inference and grammatical constraints. And you could present further experimental data from cognitive science about how people handle self-referential statements in experiments that test truth-conditional reasoning, metacognition, and belief revision. In closing, the liar paradox does not merely torment logicians. It remains a living thread woven into the fabric of philosophy of language, epistemology, logic, and cognitive science. It invites us to re-examine the foundations of truth and to appreciate the delicate balance between what we can know, what we can prove, and what remains beyond the reach of our most ambitious systems. It is a reminder that the language we use to describe the world is not a neutral instrument, but a living instrument, one that can turn back on us and reveal the architecture of our own thinking. And in that sense, the paradox is a teacher. It instructs us about the limits and possibilities of human reason, about the ways we navigate self-reference, and about the paths we choose to take when we respond to a question that asks us to look at truth from within its own mirror.